Tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most extraordinary love stories. A love so powerful it literally changed the face of monarchy, shaped the destiny of Europe, and created traditions we still follow today. But here's what most people don't know. It all started with a 17-year-old girl who was desperately trying to avoid marriage and a young German prince from a kingdom so tiny that the King of England called it irrelevant. Their first meeting wasn't love at first sight, it was something far more complicated. And yet, against all odds, against political pressure, against even their own initial hesitations, these two teenagers would go on to create a bond so deep that when death finally came, one of them would spend 40 years in mourning, wearing black every single day, refusing to ever truly live again. Tonight, we're going back to where it all began. April 1836, Kensington Palace, London, a birthday party that nobody realized would change history forever. So before we step into that palace together, I want to ask you something. If you're someone who loves real stories about real people, stories that remind us love is messy and complicated and beautiful all at once, would you take just a second to hit that subscribe button? And if tonight's story moves you, maybe tap that like button or drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. Are you in bed with the lights low on a night drive, washing dishes? I genuinely love knowing you're here with me. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights. Let the world outside fade away for a while. And let's travel back nearly 200 years to meet two teenagers who had no idea they were about to become the most famous couple in the world. Picture this. It's April 24th, 1836. Princess Alexandrina Victoria, though everyone just calls her Victoria, is turning 17. She's tiny, barely 5't tall, with piercing blue eyes and a stubborn streak that terrifies her handlers. She's been raised in what they called the Kensington system, which is really just a fancy term for isolation. She doesn't have friends her own age. She's not allowed to be alone, ever. She sleeps in her mother's bedroom. She can't even walk downstairs without someone holding her hand. Literally, it's suffocating, it's lonely. And it's all because she's third in line to the British throne. And the people controlling her mother want to control her too. But tonight, for her 17th birthday, there's a ball, music, dancing, hundreds of candles making everything glow. And among the guests are three people who will change everything. Her uncle Leopold, who's now the King of Belgium, and Leopold's nephews, Prince Ernest and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wait, Saxe-Coburg and what? You're not alone. Even King William IV, who was ruling Britain at the time, thought this place was basically nowhere. It was a collection of small territories in what's now Germany, so minor on the European stage that suggesting Victoria marry into that family was, in William's words, beneath her station. But here's where it gets interesting. This meeting wasn't an accident. Uncle Leopold had been planning this moment for years. You see, Victoria's mother and Albert's father were siblings. Leopold saw an opportunity to strengthen his own family's influence by uniting these two branches. It was calculated, strategic, political, except, and this is the beautiful part, nobody told the teenagers that. So when Victoria came down those palace stairs that evening and saw Albert for the first time, she had no idea she was looking at her future husband. She just saw a boy her own age, who was, in her own words, extremely handsome. Let's pause here, because I need you to understand how rare this was. This is 1836. Royal marriages weren't about love. They were about power, alliances, land, treaties. Princesses were traded like chess pieces. The idea that a future queen might actually be attracted to her intended spouse, that was practically revolutionary. And Victoria didn't just think Albert was cute, she was genuinely struck by him. Later that night, she wrote in her diary, and I'm quoting directly from her actual journal, "He is extremely handsome. His hair is about the same color as mine. His eyes are large and blue, And he has a beautiful nose and a very sweet mouth with fine teeth. Now, can we just take a moment to appreciate this? Here's a teenage girl writing in her private diary, gushing about a boy's teeth. It's so normal, so human, so incredibly relatable. She's not thinking about political alliances or European power dynamics. She's thinking about his smile and that detail, that beautiful nose, that sweet mouth. It tells us everything about where her mind was. This wasn't duty, this was genuine attraction. But here's something even more extraordinary that most people never learn about. Victoria and Albert actually shared something incredibly rare. Something that connected them before they even met. They were born just 3 months apart in 1819. Victoria in May, Albert in August. And here's the wild part. They were delivered by the exact same midwife. Her name was Charlotte Hayden von Zald, and she was apparently the go-to midwife for minor German royalty. Think about that for a second. The same woman who brought Victoria into the world in Kensington Palace traveled to Bavaria 3 months later and delivered Albert at Schloss Rose. Now it's almost like the universe was saying, these two are connected whether they know it yet or not. During that birthday ball, Victoria and Albert danced together multiple times. Sure, he described one particular dance as very merry, and you can almost feel her excitement jumping off the page of her diary. For a girl who'd spent her entire childhood isolated, controlled, never allowed to just be a normal teenager, this must have felt like freedom. Here was someone her own age, someone who didn't want anything from her politically because he didn't even live in England, someone who could just be, well, fun. Albert, for his part, seemed to like Victoria too, though his diary entries are more reserved. He noted her friendliness and good humor, but he also mentioned something telling. He kept feeling faint during the late evening events. Albert wasn't used to the late nights and heavy social schedule of English court life. He'd been raised in a smaller, quieter environment, where Victoria was finding liberation in the dancing and excitement. Albert was quite literally exhausted. It's actually kind of endearing. This German prince trying so hard to keep up with English social expectations and just wanting to go to bed. But here's what I find most fascinating about this first meeting. Neither of them was ready for marriage. Victoria wrote to Uncle Leopold after Albert and Ernest left, saying how much she'd enjoyed their visit, but she made it clear she had no intention of marrying anyone anytime soon. She was 17. She liked Albert, sure, but marriage, that was something for the distant future. And Albert, well, he went back to Germany to continue his education at the University of Bonn, studying law and philosophy and political economy, probably not thinking too much about that tiny English princess he danced with. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that in just 1 year, everything would change. King William IV would die. Victoria would become queen of the most powerful empire on earth. And suddenly, that 17-year-old girl writing about white teeth in her diary would become the most sought-after marriage prospect in Europe. Every prince, every king, every scheming politician would want a piece of her. The pressure to marry would become overwhelming, and the one person she'd felt genuinely comfortable with, that German prince with the beautiful nose, would suddenly become both her salvation and the source of tremendous controversy. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because right now in April 1836, they're just 2 teenagers at a birthday party. She's noticing his smile. He's trying not to fall asleep during the dancing. Uncle Leopold is watching from the corner, probably smiling to himself, thinking his plan is working perfectly, and nobody, not Victoria, not Albert, not even Uncle Leopold, has any idea that they're standing at the beginning of a love story so powerful that it will still be talked about, analyzed, and admired nearly 200 years later. You know what strikes me most about this first meeting? It's how ordinary it was. There were no lightning bolts, no dramatic declarations. Just a teenage girl who thought a boy was handsome and wrote about it in her diary. Just a teenage boy who was polite and charming but also kind of tired. Just a birthday party, with music and dancing, and probably some really awkward small talk. And yet, from that ordinary moment, from that simple first impression, something extraordinary was about to grow. Because here's the truth about first impressions. We never really know which ones will matter. Victoria couldn't have known that the boy whose teeth she admired would become her husband, her advisor, her greatest love, and ultimately her deepest loss. Albert couldn't have known that the friendly English princess would become the queen he'd serve, the woman he'd love so deeply that their partnership would redefine what monarchy could be. In that moment, there were just two Opal meeting at a party. But sometimes that's all it takes. One moment, one dance, one beautiful nose noticed and written down in a diary, and now you might be wondering what happened next. How did they get from that sweet first meeting to actually getting married? Well, that journey is going to take us through some unexpected territory, because in just a few months, Victoria's world is about to completely transform. She's about to go from sheltered princess to reigning queen overnight. She's about to gain power beyond anything she imagined and then discover that power comes with a loneliness she never expected. And when Albert comes back into her life 3 years later, she's going to be a completely different person. Stronger, yes, more independent, absolutely, but also more desperate for genuine connection than she's ever been. So stay with me, because what comes next is where this story really begins to reveal itself. Not as a simple fairy tale, but as something far more real, far more complicated, and far more beautiful than any fairy tale could ever be. June 20th, 1837. Everything changed in the middle of the night. Victoria was asleep in her mother's room. Because remember, even as an 18-year-old heir to the throne, she still wasn't allowed to sleep alone. When at 6 o'clock in the morning, her mother shook her awake. The Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Cunningham were downstairs. They needed to see her immediately. Victoria threw on her dressing gown, walked into her sitting room alone for the first time in her life, and received the news that would alter everything. King William IV had died at 12 minutes to that morning. She was now Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Let me read you exactly what Victoria wrote in her journal that day, because her words capture something extraordinary. Lord Cunningham then acquainted me that my poor uncle, the King, W, as no more and had expired at 12 minutes to this morning, and consequently that I am Queen. That phrase, I am Queen. It's so simple, so direct, no fanfare, no dramatic flourish, just a girl processing the most overwhelming moment of her life. And here's what breaks my heart about this moment. Victoria was 18 years old. 18? Think about what you were doing at 18. Maybe starting college, working your first real job, trying to figure out who you even were. Now, imagine waking up one morning and being responsible for the most powerful empire on earth. An empire that stretched across continents. An empire where, as they said, the sun never set on British soil. All of that dropped into the lap of a girl who'd never been allowed to make her own decisions, who'd never been alone, who'd been controlled her entire life by people who saw her as a means to power. The first thing Victoria did as queen was revolutionary. She asked to be alone for an hour. 1 hour by herself. Nobody supervising her, nobody controlling her movements, nobody telling her what to do. For a girl who'd spent 18 years under the Kensington system, that hour of solitude was freedom. And in that hour, something shifted inside her. She'd been Princess Victoria, sheltered and controlled. Now, she was Queen Victoria, and she decided right then and there that nobody would control her again. Within 3 weeks, she made an even more dramatic move. She left Kensington Palace and moved into Buckingham Palace. Now you might be thinking, so what? She moved houses. But understand what this meant. Buckingham Palace had been sitting there for years, barely used. It was technically a royal residence, but no monarch had actually lived there as their primary home. Victoria became the first British sovereign to make Buckingham Palace the official royal residence, and it's been the heart of the British monarchy ever since. That decision, that move was her way of saying, I'm starting fresh. I'm not living under anyone's shadow. This is my reign now, and the public loved her for it. On her coronation day, approximately 400,000 people lined the streets of London just to catch a glimpse of their new young queen. 400,000. In 1837, when London's population was only about 2 million, that means roughly 1 in 5 Londoners came out to see her. Victoria wrote in her journal about their good humor and excessive loyalty, and you can feel her surprise and delight jumping off the page. She'd spent her whole life isolated, and suddenly she was beloved. But here's where things get complicated. And this is where Victoria's story becomes something we can all relate to, even now. Because with all that power, all that freedom, all that public adoration, came something Victoria hadn't anticipated. Crushing loneliness. She was the queen. Nobody could tell her what to do. But that also meant nobody was truly her equal. Every conversation was formal. Every interaction was filtered through protocol. The very power that gave her freedom also built walls around her. And within months of taking the throne, people started asking the question that would haunt her for the next 3 years. When would she marry? And Victoria's response was essentially, not anytime soon. Thank you very much. See, Victoria had tasted independence, and she wasn't eager to give it up. Under British law and custom, a husband would have certain rights over his wife, even if that wife happened to be queen. Victoria loved being in charge. She loved making decisions. She loved the fact that for the first time in her life, she was the one with the power. Marriage felt like going backward, like voluntarily putting herself back under someone's control. In her own words written to her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, she said, marriage was a shocking alternative to her current independence. Now, here's where I need to tell you about the political drama happening behind the scenes, because it's absolutely wild. Remember King William IV, who just died? Well, before he died, he'd been very vocal about who he thought Victoria should marry. And spoiler alert, it definitely wasn't Albert. William wanted Victoria to marry Prince Alexander of the Netherlands, son of the King of Orange. This made perfect political sense. The Netherlands was a strong ally, the House of Orange was prestigious, and Alexander was on paper a solid match. William actually invited Alexander and his brother to England in 1837, specifically to push this match forward. There were dinners, balls, introductions, the whole royal courtship routine, and Victoria absolutely hated them. I need to read you what she wrote about the Orange princes because it's savage in the most delightful way. She wrote to Uncle Leopold, "The Netherlander boys are very plain. They look heavy, dull, and frightened, and are not at all prepossessing. Heavy, dull, and frightened. Can you imagine being a prince, thinking you're making a great impression on the future queen, and later finding out she thought you looked scared and boring?" Victoria did not hold back. But here's what this tells us about her. Victoria was one of the few people in her position who refused to treat marriage as purely political. Yes, she understood the diplomatic implications. Yes, she knew her choice of husband would affect international relations. But she also believed, and this was radical for the time, that she should actually like the person she married. Revolutionary concept, right? So there she was, 18, 19, then 20 years old, Queen of Britain, beloved by her people, powerful beyond measure, and absolutely adamant that she wasn't getting married any time soon. Her advisors were getting nervous. The Parliament were getting nervous. Oughting to mutter, the question of succession was becoming urgent. What if something happened to Victoria before she had an heir? But Victoria held firm, and honestly, I admire this about her because think about the pressure she was under. Every newspaper was speculating about her marriage. Every political figure had an opinion. Every foreign monarch was either offering up their sons or watching nervously to see which alliance Britain would form. And through it all, Victoria basically said, "I'll get married when I'm ready, and not a moment before." Now, if you're wondering whether she ever thought about Albert during this time, well, of course she did. She'd enjoyed meeting him back at her 17th birthday. She'd written kindly about him, but 3 years had passed since that first meeting. 3 years in which she'd become queen, discovered her own power, and built walls around her heart to protect her independence. Albert was a pleasant memory, nothing more. Also, she told herself, what Victoria didn't realize, and this is where the story gets really interesting, is that she wasn't the only one who changed in those 3 years. Remember, Albert, that German prince who kept falling asleep during parties. He'd gone back to university, studied philosophy and law and political economy, traveled through Italy, grown more confident, more educated, more mature. He wasn't the tired 17-year-old boy anymore. He was becoming the man who would eventually transform the British monarchy. And Uncle Leopold. Oh, Leopold hadn't given up on his plan. Not even close. He'd been patient, letting Victoria settle into her role as queen, letting the public pressure for marriage build naturally. But by 1839, he decided it was time to make his move, time to bring Albert back to England, time to see if that first spark between two 17-year-olds could be rekindled between a queen and a prince. The question was, would Victoria, who'd spent 3 years jealously guarding her independence, even want to see Albert again? Would she remember that beautiful nose and sweet mouth she'd once written about, or would she see him as just another prince trying to marry into power, another political alliance trying to trap her into losing the freedom she'd fought so hard to claim? I want you to think about something for a second. Have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between independence and connection? Where opening your heart to someone felt like giving up control? Where love seemed like a threat to everything you'd built for yourself? Because that's exactly where Victoria was. She'd escaped one prison, the Kensington system, her mother's control, the suffocating protocols of her childhood. Now everyone wanted her to walk willingly into another one, marriage. The irony is that the one person who might actually understand her, who might actually respect her power rather than try to diminish it, was Albert. But Victoria didn't know that yet. She couldn't know it. All she knew was that Uncle Leopold kept writing letters suggesting Albert visit again, and she kept making excuses to delay. Too busy with royal duties, not ready, not interested, maybe next year. But Leopold was persistent. And finally, in October 1839, Victoria agreed to a visit. She told herself it was just courtesy, a chance to see her cousins again. Nothing serious, certainly not about marriage. She'd made that very clear to everyone, including Lord Melbourne. She wasn't ready to marry anyone. And when she did marry, it would be her choice, made in her own time, on her own terms. What Victoria didn't expect, what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that when Albert stepped through the doors of Windsor Castle that October, she would look at him and feel something shift inside her, something that had nothing to do with politics or duty or diplomatic alliances. Something that terrified her precisely because it felt so real. But that moment, that second meeting, that transformation from resistance to surrender, that's a story powerful enough to need its own telling. And trust me, what happens next will show you that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are the very things keeping out exactly what we need. 7 in the evening, October 10th, 1839, Windsor Castle. Albert's carriage rolled through the gates, and Victoria stood at a window waiting. She told herself she was calm, composed. This was just a courtesy visit, after all. She'd see her cousins Albert and Ernest again, exchange pleasantries, maybe have some dinners together, and they'd go back to Germany. No pressure, no expectations, just a simple family reunion. And then Albert stepped out of the carriage, and Victoria's carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. Later that night, she grabbed her journal, and I love this about her. She always turned to her journal when emotions overwhelmed her, and she wrote, "It was with some emotion that I beheld Albert, who is beautiful, not handsome this time, beautiful. And then she proceeded to catalogue every single detail of his appearance like she was painting a portrait in words. His charming eyes, his pretty mouth, and delicate mustachios and slight, but very slight whiskers. His beautiful figure with broad shoulders and a fine waist. Can we just pause for a second and appreciate this? Here's the Queen of Britain, one of the most powerful people on earth, and she's in her room writing about a man's waist, his shoulders, the exact style of his facial hair. This wasn't political calculation. This wasn't diplomatic strategy. This was a 20-year-old woman completely blindsided by attraction she hadn't expected, and definitely hadn't planned for. Because here's what had happened. Albert had changed. 3 years ago, he'd been a sweet but somewhat awkward 17-year-old who kept falling asleep at parties. Now he was 20. He'd traveled through Italy studying art and architecture. He'd completed rigorous studies at the University of Bonn in law, philosophy, political economy. He spoke multiple languages fluently, German and English obviously, but also French and Italian. He was cultured, educated, confident in a way he hadn't been before. And Victoria, who'd spent 3 years around politicians and courtiers and people who wanted things from her, suddenly found herself face to face with someone who was genuinely impressive, without trying to impress her. The next few days were a whirlwind. Victoria arranged private dinners. They talked about music. Both of them loved it. They played piano together, their hands moving across the keys in duets that felt intimate in a way conversation couldn't quite capture. Victoria watched Albert interact with her court, noticed how graceful he was, how thoughtful, how he seemed to understand the nuances of political discussion without being pushy about his opinions. Every moment she spent with him, she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years of being queen. She felt seen not as a crown, not as a political opportunity, just as Victoria. By October 14th, just 4 days after Albert arrived, Victoria had made up her mind. She told Lord Melbourne, her Prime Minister and closest confidant, "My mind is made up about marrying dearest Albert." Now, if you've ever made a big life decision really quickly, you know that feeling of certainty mixed with terror, that voice in your head saying, "This is right, I know this is right, but, oh my God, what am I doing?" That's where Victoria was. She knew she wanted to marry Albert, but there was a massive, unprecedented problem. She was the Queen, and under British royal protocol, nobody could propose to a reigning monarch. Think about what this meant. For all of history, in almost every culture, men proposed to women. That was the natural order of things. Right. The man gets down on one knee, asks the question. The woman says yes or no, but Victoria couldn't wait for Albert to propose because he literally wasn't allowed to. The protocol was absolute. You don't propose to your queen. It would be presumptuous, inappropriate, possibly even treasonous. So if this marriage was going to happen, Victoria would have to break with centuries of tradition and ask him herself, "Have you ever had to make the first move in a relationship?" Even in our modern world, with all our talk about equality, it can be terrifying right now. Imagine you're doing it in 1839, when gender roles were rigid as stone, when women, even queens, were expected to be passive and receptive, never forward or aggressive. And imagine the whole world is watching. Every word you say will be recorded, analyzed, gossiped about in every court in Europe. The pressure must have been absolutely crushing. But Victoria did it anyway. On October 15th, 1839, she summoned Albert to her private room, just the two of them, and she proposed, I need to read you exactly what she wrote in her journal that night, because it's one of the most beautiful and human things I've ever read. She wrote, I told him it would make me too happy if he would consent to what I wished, to marry me. We embraced each other over and over again, and he was so kind, so affectionate. Oh, to feel I was and am loved by such an angel as Albert was too great delight to describe. Can you hear the joy in those words, the relief? She'd taken this enormous risk, broken protocol, put her heart on the line, and he said yes, not because he had to, not because it was politically advantageous, Though obvio, sly it was, but because, as she wrote, he loved her and she could feel it. But here's where the fairy tale hits reality hard, because the moment Victoria and Albert's engagement became public, all hell broke loose politically. Remember, Albert was from Saxe, Coburg and Gotha, which most British politicians and citizens saw as basically irrelevant on the European stage. There were immediate questions. What title would he have? What would his role be? And most contentiously, how much money would Parliament grant him? Now this is where it gets really messy. Back in 1816, when Princess Charlotte, the former heir to the throne, had married Prince Leopold, Parliament had granted Leopold an allowance of £50,000 per year. £50,000, that was the precedent, so naturally Victoria assumed Albert would receive the same. Parliament said absolutely not. They offered him £30,000. Victoria was furious. She fought tooth and nail for Albert to receive the full 50,000. She gave speeches. She lobbied politicians. She made it clear this was deeply important to her. And you know what? She lost. Parliament voted and Albert got £30,000. It was a direct insult, a way of telling both Victoria and Albert, he's not important enough, he's not British enough, he doesn't deserve equal treatment. But that humiliation was nothing compared to what came next. Victoria wanted Albert to have the title of king, not king in the sense of ruling. She would still be the monarch, but king as a title, a recognition of his status as her husband and consort. She believed, and these are her words, that he ought to have this title. It made sense to her. They would be partners. Why shouldn't he have a title that reflected that partnership? The Chancellor shut her down immediately. Want to know why? Because in the British hierarchy of titles, king outranks queen. If Albert became king, even just in title, it would ethnically make him superior to Victoria, and Parliament wasn't about to let a German prince outrank their British queen. So Albert would be prince consort, not king, just prince. And it would take 17 more years. 17 years before Victoria could even formally grant him the title prince consort as an official designation. For 17 years he was just His Royal Highness, Prince Albert, not even Prince of the United Kingdom. Just Prince Albert, as if he were some minor noble who'd married. Well, now I want you to think about this from both of their perspectives, because this is where their love story becomes so much more complex and real than any fairy tale. From Victoria's side, she'd finally opened her heart to someone. She'd taken the terrifying step of proposing, of making herself vulnerable, and now Parliament was publicly disrespecting the man she loved, paying him less than precedent demanded, denying him a title she felt he deserved. Every insult to Albert felt like an insult to her judgment, her choice, her love, and there was nothing she could do about it. For all her power as queen, she couldn't override Parliament on this. It was one of her first real lessons in the limits of constitutional monarchy. From Albert's side, imagine leaving your home country to marry someone you care about, knowing you'll never rule in your own right, never have real political power, always be in your wife's shadow. And then imagine arriving in your new country and being told publicly that you're worth less than the man who'd had your position before. That your new countrymen don't trust you, don't value you, see you as an outsider trying to grab power through marriage. How do you not take that personally? How do you not feel humiliated? And yet, and this is crucial, Albert said yes anyway. He knew all of this was coming. Uncle Leopold had prepared him, warned him what he was getting. I can't. Albert understood that marrying Victoria meant giving up any dreams of independent power. It meant living in her shadow forever. It meant dealing with a British establishment that would never fully accept him, and he chose her anyway. That's the sacrifice people don't talk about enough. We talk about Victoria wearing black for 40 years after Albert died. And yes, that's a dramatic display of love. But what about Albert's sacrifice? What about the fact that he gave up his entire future, his potential, his independence, to support a woman he loved? In an era when men were supposed to be dominant, When husbands were supposed to control their wives, Albert willingly entered a marriage where he would always be subordinate, not just legally. Victoria was queen, so that was unavoidable, but socially, politically, in every way that mattered to a man of that time. You know what I find most moving about this moment? Neither of them was naive. Victoria knew she was asking Albert to give up everything. Albert knew exactly what he was signing up for. They both went into this marriage with their eyes wide open, aware of all the complications and controversies and challenges ahead, and they chose each other anyway. Not because it was easy, not because it was politically perfect, but because sometimes love means looking at all the very good reasons not to do something and doing it anyway. On November 23rd, 1839, Victoria stood before her Privy Council and formally declared her intention to marry Prince Albert of Saxes, Coburg and Gothia. The wedding was set for February 10th, 1840, just over 2 months away. 2 months for Albert to prepare to leave his home forever. 2 months for Victoria to prepare to share her life, her throne, her power with someone else, for the first time since becoming queen. 2 months for both of them to wonder if they were making the biggest mistake of their lives or the best decision they would ever make. The answer, as we'll see, was somehow both, because what was about to happen when they actually got married? When the reality of their relationship collided with the public spectacle of a royal wedding, when political pressures met personal intimacy, when two strong-willed people tried to figure out how to build a life together under impossible circumstances, that was going to test them in ways neither of them expected. But before we get to the wedding itself, before we talk about the white dress that changed fashion forever, and the vows that were witnessed by thousands, I need you to understand something important about what was about to unfold. Because this wedding wasn't just the beginning of a marriage. It was the beginning of a revolution in how the world thought about royal relationships, about power and partnership, about what it meant to be both a sovereign and a spouse. And it all started with one young woman brave enough to ask the question that tradition said she shouldn't ask, and one young man brave enough to say yes to a life that would give him everything and nothing all at once. There are moments in history that ripple forward through time, touching lives centuries later in ways nobody could have predicted. February 10th, 1840 was one of those moments, and it all came down to a single, seemingly simple decision. What color dress should a bride wear? The morning of her wedding, Victoria stood in her chambers at Buckingham Palace, preparing for the most public moment of her life. Outside, the streets of London were already packed with people. Not hundreds, hundreds of thousands. Some estimates put the crowd at over 400,000 souls, all hoping to catch a glimpse of their young queen on her wedding day. That's roughly 1 in every 5 people living in London at the time. The entire city had essentially shut down for this wedding. But inside the palace, Victoria was focused on something that probably seemed trivial to everyone around her. Her dress. She'd made a decision that had confused her dressmakers, puzzled her advisors, and would ultimately change wedding fashion forever. She was going to wear white. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, well, duh, of course a bride wears white, I need you to understand something crucial. That wasn't normal in 1840, not even close. For centuries, literally hundreds of years, royal brides wore rich, vibrant colors. Red was popular because it symbolized wealth and passion. Blue represented purity and the Virgin Mary. Deep browns, greens, golds, these were the colors of importance, of status, of royalty. White was considered plain, boring, the color you wore for everyday dress, not for the most important day of your life. But Victoria had her reasons. She'd chosen a white Spitalfields satin and lace dress, and the symbolism was deliberate. White represented purity, yes, but also simplicity. Victoria wanted to marry Albert, not as a political spectacle, though it obviously was, but as a woman marrying a man she loved. The white dress was her way of saying, strip away the crown, the politics, the empire, and this is still just two people choosing each other. She had also sketched the design for her bridesmaids' dresses herself. 12 young women who would wear simple white dresses trimmed with roses. Victoria gave that sketch to the Duchess of Southernthorland, her mistress of the robes, who supervised the making of each dress. Everything about this wedding was designed to feel more personal, more intimate, more human than royal weddings had been before. And here's another revolutionary choice. Victoria insisted the wedding take place in the afternoon, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, to be precise. This was the first royal wedding, held in daylight in over 100 red years. Why does that matter? Because traditional royal weddings happened late at night, private affairs witnessed by only the most elite members of court. By holding the ceremony in the afternoon, Victoria ensured that thousands of ordinary people could line the streets, see her carriage procession, feel part of the celebration. It was democracy in action, not in government, but in joy. At noon, Victoria left Buckingham Palace in a grand carriage procession. She was escorted by her ladies-in-waiting, by guards in full ceremonial dress, by mounted cavalry whose horses' hooves clattered on the cobblestones. The route to the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace was only about a mile, but the carriage moved slowly, deliberately, so people could see their queen. And what they saw was a young woman in a white dress, looking nervous and excited, and so utterly human that the crowd's cheers became almost deafening. Albert arrived separately, escorted by a squadron of senior cavalry. He wore his military uniform, looking every bit the romantic hero. When Victoria's carriage finally reached the Chapel Royal, her 12 bridesmaids, all daughters of nobility, all in their matching white dresses, carefully carried her train up the chapel steps. Since Victoria's father had died when she was an infant, her uncle, Prince Augustus Frederick, the Duke of Sussex, walked her down the aisle. Can you imagine that moment? Victoria, barely 21 years old, walking toward Albert, who was standing at the altar, waiting for her. Everything they'd been through. That first meeting when they were 17, the 3 years apart, the second meeting where everything changed, the political battles, the public scrutiny, all of it led to this moment. 2 people who could have taken the easy political path, but chose instead to follow something messier and more real. The ceremony itself was traditional Anglican liturgy, but what happened afterward, that's what people really wanted to know about. Because Victoria, in a move that was both completely understandable and totally scandalous for the time, kept a very detailed account of her wedding night in her journal. I'm going to read you what she wrote, because it's honestly one of the most joyful, unguarded things you'll ever hear from a Victorian-era monarch. She began the entry with, "I never spent such an evening." Those capital letters, that repetition, you can feel her excitement practically vibrating off the page. Then she wrote, "My dearest, dear Albert, his excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before. He clasped me in his arms, and we kissed each other again and again. His beauty, his sweetness and gentleness. Really, how can I ever be thankful enough to have such a husband?" She goes on describing how he called her by names of tenderness I've never yet heard used to me before. Was bliss beyond belief. Oh, this was the happiest day of my life. Now, I know some of you might be blushing right now, but here's what I love about this. Victoria's honesty. She'd spent her whole life being controlled, being told what to feel, how to act, what was proper and appropriate. And on her wedding night, she just let herself be completely wonderfully human. She was in love. She was happy. She wasn't ashamed of it. And she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even in writing. But beyond the personal joy of that night, what Victoria and Albert had just done, that afternoon wedding in white, was about to reshape culture in ways they couldn't possibly have imagined. Within months, white wedding dresses started appearing in fashion magazines. Middle-class women who could afford it began requesting white dresses from their dress makers. The trend spread from England to Europe, to America. By the end of the 19th century, white wedding dresses had become the standard in Western culture, and it all traces back to Victoria's choice on February 10th, 1840. Think about that for a second. How many weddings have you been to where the bride wore white? How many wedding dresses have you seen in store windows, in magazines, on Pinterest boards? That entire tradition, that multi-billion-dollar wedding dress industry, built on the idea that brides wear white, started with one young woman who just wanted to marry the man she loved in a dress that felt meaningful to her. But the white dress wasn't the only tradition Victoria and Albert would revolutionize. Remember, Albert was from Germany, and he brought German traditions with him. The most famous Christmas trees. Now, Christmas trees had existed before Albert. German immigrants had been decorating trees for years, but when Victoria and Albert set up a Christmas tree at Windsor Castle and the Illustrated London News published an image of the royal family gathered around it, decorating it together, exchanging gifts beneath it, suddenly everyone wanted a Christmas tree. The tradition exploded across Britain and then America. Within a generation, Christmas trees went from a minor German custom to a central part of how the Western world celebrated Christmas. Gift-giving at Christmas, also popularized by Victoria and Albert, who were photographed exchanging thoughtful presents with their children. The image of a harmonious family gathered together for Christmas, of parents and children sharing joy and love. That became the ideal that everyone else tried to emulate. Victoria and Albert essentially created the modern concept of Christmas as a family holiday. And then there's photography. Victoria and Albert were absolutely obsessed with the new technology of photography. They commissioned portraits constantly, both formal ones for public distribution and private ones, just for themselves. They arranged photo albums together. They gave each other photographs as gifts for birthdays and holidays. There's even this incredibly romantic photograph from 1854 where Albert was photographed by Brian Edward Dupper, and Victoria, as a birthday present to Albert, had herself photographed by the same photographer while holding Albert's photograph. She's literally holding a picture of him while posing for her own picture. If that's not the 1800s equivalent of couple selfies, I don't know what is. These photographs did something revolutionary. They made the royal family visible and relatable. For the first time in history, ordinary people could see what their monarch actually looked like beyond formal painted portraits. They could see Victoria and Albert at home in ordinary clothes, playing with their children, looking like any other family. Just with better furniture and more servants. It humanized the monarchy in a way that had never been possible before, and people loved them for it. The public ate up these images of domestic happiness. In an era of rapid industrialization, of social upheaval, of cities growing too fast, and traditional ways of life disappearing, Victoria and Albert represented stability. They represented the idea that amidst all the change, some things, love, family, partnership, remained constant and good. But here's what I find most fascinating about their wedding and its aftermath. Victoria and Albert essentially invented the concept of the family monarchy. Before them, royalty was distant, removed, sometimes scandalous. George IV, Victoria's uncle, had been a disaster. Extravagant, unfaithful, wildly unpopular. The monarchy's reputation had been in serious trouble. Victoria and Albert transformed it by modeling domestic virtue. They showed that a monarch could be powerful and moral, that royalty could set an example not through divine right, but through actual behavior worth emulating. And the middle class, the growing, increasingly powerful middle class of Victorian Britain, saw themselves reflected in Victoria and Albert's marriage. Not the wealth, obviously, not the palaces or the titles, but the values, hard work, education for children, partnership in marriage, moral uprightness. The middle class was building Britain's economy, driving its expansion, and they wanted to believe their values mattered. Victoria and Albert validated that belief by living those values themselves. or at least by appearing to. Now, was it all genuine? Was their marriage really as perfect as those photographs and public appearances suggested? Well, that's a more complicated question, and one we'll explore as their story continues. But on February 10th, 1840, as Victoria stood in her white dress and exchanged vows with Albert, as the crowds cheered outside, and the future spread before them, unknown and full of possibility. In that moment the fairy tale was real, the love was real, the hope was real, and when they left for their honeymoon, just 2 days at Windsor Castle, because Victoria insisted she couldn't abandon her royal duties for longer, they carried with them not just their personal happiness, but the expectations of millions. They'd shown people a new vision of what marriage could be, what monarchy could be, what love looked like when it was allowed to flourish in public view. The question was, could they live up to that vision? Could two people, no matter how much they loved each other, sustain that image of perfect partnership under the crushing weight of public scrutiny and royal responsibility? Could Albert find meaning and purpose in a role that gave him no real power? Could Victoria see her throne, her decisions, her very identity with someone else after fighting so hard for independence? The answers would unfold over the next 21 years. Years of extraordinary triumph and hidden struggle, of public adoration and private conflict, of a partnership so complex and so profound that even now, almost 2 centuries later, we're still trying to understand what made it work and what that partnership created. The empire they influenced, the family they built, the legacy they left that would shape not just Britain but all of Europe in ways both beautiful and tragic. But first, they had to figure out the most basic, most difficult thing: how to actually be married to each other, how to navigate the reality behind the fairy tale. And that reality, as it turns out, was going to be far more challenging than either of them expected. The honeymoon lasted exactly 2 days. 2 days. Most newlyweds would want weeks, maybe months, to just be together away from the world. But on February 12th, 1840, just 48 hours after their wedding, Victoria insisted they return to London. She had government papers to review, ministers to meet, decisions to make. The empire, as she saw it, couldn't wait. Albert must have felt the reality of his new life settling in like a weight. He'd married the Queen of Britain, yes, but what did that actually mean for him? What was he supposed to do all day? He had no official role, no defined responsibilities, no power beyond whatever Victoria chose to give him. And Victoria, for all her love, had spent 3 years jealously guarding her independence. She wasn't about to hand over her authority just because she'd gotten married. So there was Albert, 20 years old, in a foreign country where half the population still viewed him with suspicion. With nothing to do but look decorative at state functions. He'd been educated at one of Europe's finest universities. He spoke multiple languages. He understood law, philosophy, political economy, art, science, and his job was essentially to stand next to Victoria at ceremonies and smile, in his own words, and this breaks my heart every time I read it. Albert wrote, "I am very happy and contented, but the difficulty in filling my place with the proper dignity is that I am only the husband, not the master in the house, only the husband." Think about what that meant in 1840. In virtually every marriage in Europe at that time, the husband was the master. He made the decisions. He controlled the finances. He held the legal authority, even if a wife had her own opinions, her own intelligence, her own capabilities. She was expected to defer to her husband. That was just how marriage worked. But Albert had married a woman who was his boss, legally, politically, in every way that mattered to the world. Victoria outranked him, and not just in title. She had actual power. She met with the Prime Minister daily. She reviewed government documents. She signed laws. She was the sovereign. And Albert was the consort, the supporting character in her story. For a man of his era, for someone with his education and abilities, that could have been humiliating. It could have bred resentment. And honestly, at first it kind of did. Victoria's household was still being run by Baroness Leon, Victoria's former governess, who'd been controlling Victoria's life for years. Leon saw Albert as a threat to her influence, and she made his life difficult in 1,000 small ways. And Victoria, caught between the woman who'd raised her and the man she just married, didn't always take Albert's side. But then something remarkable happened, something that would transform their marriage from a potential power struggle into one of history's greatest working partnerships. And it started with a simple, almost mundane decision. Victoria had their desks moved, not to separate rooms, not to opposite sides of the palace. She had their desks placed right next to each other, side by side, so close that they could work together, papers spread between them, conferring on decisions, sharing the burden of governance. Have you ever worked closely with someone you love? I mean, really work together, not just in the same building, but on the same projects, making decisions together, problem-solving together. It's intimate in a way that's hard to describe. You learn how the other person thinks. You develop a shorthand. You start finishing each other's sentences. That's what Victoria and Albert did. Except instead of running a small business or planning a family vacation, they were essentially running an empire. And slowly, gradually, Victoria began to realize something. Albert was brilliant, not just educated, brilliant. When political crisis arose, Albert could analyze the situation from multiple angles, seeing implications Victoria sometimes missed. When foreign diplomats visited, Albert could converse with them in their own languages, making connections that strengthened Britain's international relationships. When complex economic or scientific questions came up, Albert had the education to understand them deeply. Most importantly, Albert had something Victoria desperately needed: objectivity. Victoria could be emotional, reactive, sometimes letting her personal feelings cloud her political judgment. Albert was more measured, more rational. Where Victoria saw insults and attacks, Albert often saw opportunities for compromise. Where Victoria wanted to fight, Albert sometimes suggested diplomacy. They balanced each other. The turning point came in 1845, during one of the darkest chapters in British history, the Irish potato famine. Starting in September of that year, a disease called potato blight began, destroying Ireland's potato crops. Now, if you're not familiar with Irish history, you need to understand potatoes weren't just food for the Irish, they were the food. The majority of Ireland's population depended on potatoes for survival. When the blight hit, it wasn't an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. Over the next several years, approximately 1 million Irish people would die of starvation and disease. Another million would immigrate, fleeing to America, Canada, Australia, anywhere that offered hope of survival. It was genocide by neglect, and the British government's response was woefully inadequate. Victoria was devastated by the reports coming from Ireland. She read accounts of entire families found dead in their homes, of children with swollen bellies from starvation, of mass graves being dug, but she also felt helpless. The British government, led by Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, and later Lord John Russell, had to manage the response. Victoria could advocate, but she couldn't dictate policy. This is where Albert stepped in. He helped Victoria draft letters to her ministers arguing for more aggressive government intervention. He helped her navigate the complex economic and political arguments about free trade versus direct aid. When Victoria's emotions threatened to overwhelm her, because how do you read about children starving and not feel overwhelmed? Albert helped her channel that emotion into constructive action. Together, they personally donated £2,000 to famine relief. Now that might not sound like much, but in 1845 terms that was enormous, roughly equivalent to about 200,000 today. They also publicly encouraged others to donate, using their influence to mobilize private charity when government response fell short. Did they do enough? No. Nobody did enough. The Irish potato famine remains one of history's great tragedies, and the British government's response remains a stain on Britain's history. But Victoria and Albert's response showed something important. They were beginning to function as a team. Albert wasn't just standing beside Victoria looking pretty anymore. He was helping her think through complex problems, helping her be a better queen, and Victoria noticed. She started relying on Albert more, asking his opinion more, including him in more meetings. By the late 1840s, Albert was essentially functioning as Victoria's private secretary, reviewing documents before she saw them, meeting with ministers on her behalf, helping draft her correspondence. He still had no official title reflecting this role. Remember, he was just Prince Albert, not even formally Prince Consort. Yet, but functionally, he'd become indispensable. The British establishment, which had been so dismissive of Albert when he'd first arrived, slowly began to change their tune. They saw how hard he worked. They saw his intelligence. They saw that he wasn't trying to control Victoria, but rather to support her. And they saw that Victoria, with Albert's help, was actually becoming a more effective monarch. But Albert's crowning achievement, the moment that would transform him from that German prince to a beloved national figure, came in 1851 with the Great Exhibition. Picture this. Albert has an idea. What if Britain hosted an international exhibition showcasing the latest innovations in industry, science, technology, and art from around the world? Not just British innovations, innovations from every country. A celebration of human progress and achievement, all gathered in one place. It would demonstrate Britain's leadership on the world stage, while also fostering international cooperation and cultural exchange. It was ambitious, it was unprecedented, and initially, a lot of people thought it was a terrible idea. Critics worried about the cost. About foreigners flooding into London, about the logistics of building a structure large enough to house such an exhibition. The satirical magazine Punch ran cartoons mocking the whole concept, but Albert believed in it, and he threw himself into making it happen with an energy and dedication that surprised everyone. He chaired the organizing committee himself. He met with architects, engineers, manufacturers, foreign diplomats. He worked 14, 16-hour days for months on end. This wasn't ceremonial involvement. Albert was personally managing the details of one of the largest public events Britain had ever attempted. The result was the Crystal Palace, built in Hyde Park, designed by Joseph Paxton. It was a marvel of Victorian engineering. A massive structure of glass and iron covering about 19 acres with over 900,000 square feet of exhibition space. It was like nothing anyone had ever seen, a palace made of light and air, modern and almost magical. The Great Exhibition opened on May 1st, 1851. Over the next 5.5 months, it would attract more than 6 million visitors. 6 million visitors in a country whose total population was only about 20 million. That means nearly 1 in 3 people in Britain visited the exhibition. And they came from all classes, wealthy aristocrats, yes, but also middle-class families, working-class people who saved for months to afford the train fare to London. And what they saw inside was breathtaking. Over 100,000 exhibits from around the world. The Coeur diamond from India, machinery from America, textiles from France, scientific instruments from Germany, works of art from across Europe. Visitors could see steam engines and hydraulic presses, daguerreotypes and telescopes, sculptures and paintings. They could witness the cutting edge of human achievement all in one place. Notable visitors included Charles Dickens, who was fascinated by the machinery, Charlotte Brontë, or who wrote that she'd never seen anything like it. Charles Darwin attended multiple times. Even Karl Marx showed up, though he was probably taking notes on capitalist excess rather than celebrating it. The exhibition made a profit of £186,000, a massive sum, and Victoria and Albert decided that money should fund future educational and cultural institutions. That profit helped establish the South Kensington Museum, which eventually became the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A, which still exists today as one of the world's great museums of art and design. It also helped fund what would eventually become the Natural History Museum and the Science Museum. So when you visit the V&A, when you marvel at its collections, you're looking at Albert's legacy, his vision of making art and culture accessible to everyone, regardless of class or background. His belief that education and beauty should be available to all people, not just the wealthy elite. The Great Exhibition transformed Albert's reputation overnight. Suddenly, he wasn't the foreign prince who'd married into power. He was the visionary who'd given Britain and the world something extraordinary. Newspapers that had mocked him now praised him. Political figures who dismissed him now sought his counsel. The public who'd viewed him with suspicion now saw him as a champion of British achievement and progress, and Victoria was bursting with pride. She attended the exhibition dozens of times, often with Albert and their growing family. By 1851, they had 5 children. She wrote in her journal about how moved she was, seeing Albert's vision realized, watching her husband receive the recognition he deserved. But here's what I find most remarkable about this period. Victoria and Albert had essentially created a dual monarchy without anyone formally acknowledging it. Albert still had no legal authority. He still couldn't vote in Parliament. He still had to get Victoria's permission for major decisions. On paper, he was powerless. But in practice, Albert was functioning as an unofficial king. He attended Privy Council meetings. He reviewed state papers. He advised on foreign policy. He represented Britain at international events. By the late 1850s, ministers were often meeting with Albert before meeting with Victoria, knowing he could give them insight into what Victoria was thinking and help them frame their proposals more effectively. Some historians argue this was problematic, that Albert was exercising power without being accountable to anyone except Victoria. And there's some truth to that. But I think it also shows something beautiful about their partnership. They'd found a way to make it work. Victoria had the authority. Albert had the influence. Together, they were more effective than either could have been alone. You know who this reminds me of? Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II. Philip, like Albert, had to give up his own career, in his case, a promising naval career, to support his wife's reign. He had no constitutional power, no official role beyond consort, and yet he became one of Elizabeth's most trusted advisors. He modernized royal protocols, championed environmental causes, worked tirelessly for decades in his wife's shadow. The parallels are striking, but there's a key difference. Philip got to grow old with Elizabeth. They had 73 years together. Albert and Victoria would get only 21. And the tragedy of what was coming, the loss that would break Victoria's heart and change the course of British history, makes their working partnership even more poignant, because they were building something together. This vision of what monarchy could be, what partnership could look like, what love in action meant. And just when they'd figured it out, just when they'd become this perfectly balanced team, everything was about to fall apart. But I'm getting ahead of the story again, because before tragedy struck, there was still so much life to be lived. Children to raise, 9 of them eventually, which was its own kind of adventure and challenge, arguments to have, because even the greatest partnerships involve conflict, joys to celebrate and sorrows to endure. And through it all, these 2 desks pushed together. These 2 people working side by side, trying to do something that had never been done before. Build a marriage where power was shared, where both partners mattered, where love and duty weren't opposites, but 2 sides of the same extraordinary coin. And that marriage, with all its complexity and compromise and genuine affection, that's what we need to explore next. Because the public saw the perfect royal couple, but behind palace doors, Victoria and Albert were figuring out what every couple has to figure out. How to live together, how to fight fairly, how to raise children, how to raise children, how to raise children, how to raise children, and their story, the real story, not the fairy tale version. That's where the deepest lessons about love and partnership are waiting to be discovered. 9 months. That's how long Victoria got to enjoy being married without the complications of motherhood. 9 months of that honeymoon phase where it's just the two of you figuring out your rhythm, building your life together, and then on November 21st, 1840, Victoria gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Victoria, though everyone called her Vicky, and Victoria hated every moment of it. I know that sounds shocking. We're so used to hearing about mothers glowing with joy, talking about how pregnancy is a miracle, how magical it all is. But Victoria was brutally honest about her experience, and what she wrote in her letters and journals would probably get her crucified on social media today. She called pregnancy the shadow side of marriage. She complained constantly about feeling unwell, about her body changing, about the discomfort and indignity of it all. After Vicky was born, Victoria wrote to her uncle Leopold that she found babies rather disgusting when they were very small. Now, before you judge her too harshly, let me give you some context. Victoria would have 9 children in 17 years. 9. That's almost constantly pregnant or recovering from childbirth from age 21 to age 38. Her body never really got a break. And unlike most women of her era, Victoria couldn't just disappear from public life during pregnancy. She was the queen. She had duties, appearances, meetings with ministers. She had to keep working while her body was doing something incredibly difficult and sometimes dangerous. Because, let's not forget, childbirth in 1840 could kill you. Medicine was primitive. Anesthesia barely existed. Women died in childbirth all the time, including wealthy, well-cared-for women. Victoria was terrified of dying in childbirth, and she was furious that it was women who had to bear this burden while men got to just, participate in the fun part and then move on with their lives. She actually wrote to Vicky years later, after Vicky was married and pregnant herself. I think our sex a most unenviable one. Most unenviable, that's pretty meaning. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Victoria didn't just struggle physically with pregnancy and childbirth. She struggled mentally. Today, we'd probably diagnose her with postpartum depression, a condition that affects roughly 1 in 7 women after giving birth. Though in Victoria's time, it had no name and no treatment. You were just expected to push through it, and Victoria couldn't push through it. After some of her pregnancies, especially the later ones, she had what her physicians delicately called hysterical episodes. We're talking about violent mood swings, uncontrollable rages, moments where she completely lost her composure. She would scream at Albert, at her ladies-in-waiting, at anyone who happened to be nearby. She would throw things. She would say cruel, cutting things she didn't mean. And here's what makes this truly heartbreaking. Victoria's doctors started whispering that maybe she'd inherited her grandfather's madness. You know who I'm talking about, right? King George III, who ruled Britain during the American Revolution and eventually descended into what historians now believe was likely porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause psychiatric symptoms. But in the early 19th century, everyone just called him Mad King George. He'd had episodes where he'd rave and rant, where he couldn't recognize his own family, where he had to be physically restrained. It was one of the great scandals and tragedies of the British monarchy. And now doctors were looking at Victoria, the granddaughter of George III, having these violent outbursts after childbirth and thinking, oh no, it's happening again. The madness is hereditary. The Queen might be going insane. Can you imagine living with that fear? Not just the fear that you might be losing your mind, but the knowledge that if you are, it could destroy the monarchy's reputation, that your child, Ren, might inherit this tendency, that the entire country is watching you, judging your every action, looking for signs that you're unfit to rule. And Albert had to manage all of this. He was 20, 21, 22 years old during these early crises, barely more than a kid himself, and he had to figure out how to support a wife who was sometimes so volatile. He didn't know what would set her off. He couldn't confide in anyone without risking Victoria's reputation. He couldn't seek help without admitting weakness that their political enemies could exploit. What he did was remarkable. He wrote Victoria notes, gentle, patient notes, that he'd slip under her door after particularly bad episodes. There's one that survived, and I need to share it with you because it shows both the depth of the problem and Albert's extraordinary compassion. He wrote, "If you are violent, I have no other choice but to leave you and retire to my room in order to give you time to recover yourself. Then you may send for me if you please. Read between the lines there." Victoria was being violent, not just verbally, but potentially physically. Albert's solution wasn't to fight back, wasn't to assert his authority as her husband, wasn't to threaten or punish. He simply removed himself from the situation and gave her space to calm down. Then, and this is crucial, he made it her choice to reconnect. "You may send for me if you please." He gave her control even in her moments of least control. That's not the behavior of someone exercising power over a spouse. That's the behavior of someone trying desperately to preserve his partner's dignity while protecting both of them from harm. And remember, this was 1840. Men were expected to control their wives, to demand obedience, to use force if necessary. Albert rejected all of that. He chose patience instead of domination, understanding instead of judgment. But, Leo, let's be clear, this situation was not okay. Victoria's mental health struggles were real and serious, and she needed help that didn't exist yet. The tragedy is that she was suffering from something biological. Hormonal changes after childbirth, possibly exacerbated by the stress of her position, and instead of getting medical treatment, she got moral judgment. Instead of understanding that postpartum depression is a medical condition, people whispered about madness and weakness and unfitness for the crown. How many women throughout history have suffered the same way? How many have been called crazy or hysterical or unstable when they were actually experiencing treatable medical conditions? How many have been shamed for struggling with motherhood when the real problem was lack of support, lack of understanding, lack of basic medical knowledge about what pregnancy and childbirth do to a woman's body and brain? Victoria was one of the most powerful women in the world, and even she couldn't escape that judgment. Imagine what it was like for ordinary women with no resources, no supportive partners, no voice to speak their truth. But here's something beautiful that came out of this struggle. Victoria and Albert became passionate advocates for better education and care for children, precisely because they understood how difficult parenting could be. They didn't want their children to suffer the isolation and control that Victoria had experienced. They wanted something better. In 1845, they'd bought Osborne House on the Isle of Wight as a private family retreat. And Albert, being Albert, didn't just buy a house. He redesigned it, supervised the building of a new wing, created formal gardens, remodeled the grounds. He was building something, a place where their family could be normal, or as normal as a royal family could be. The most innovative thing they did was the Swiss cottage bee. Built in 1853 to 1854, this wasn't a playhouse in the traditional sense. It was a miniature house where the royal children could learn practical skills. The boys had their own garden plots where they grew vegetables, learning about agriculture and biology. The girls learned cooking in a real working kitchen. They all learned carpentry, building things with their own hands. This was revolutionary. Royal children didn't do manual labor. They didn't learn to cook or garden or build. Those were skills for common people. But Victoria and Albert believed their children needed to understand how the world actually worked. They needed practical skills, not just academic knowledge and court protocol. Each child also had their own little wheelbarrow and set of gardening tools marked with their initials. They could sell their vegetables back to their father at market rates, teaching them about commerce and the value of work. It was like a very posh version of experiential learning, but the principle was solid. Learn by doing. Understand the world through your own efforts. not just through books and tutors. Now, did Victoria and Albert's parenting work perfectly? Well, that's complicated. Let me tell you about each of their 9 children, because their stories reveal both the successes and the limitations of even the most well-intentioned parenting. Vicky, the eldest, was probably the most successful from her parents' perspective. She was brilliant, quick-witted, shared her father's love of learning. She married Prince Frederick William of Prussia, and eventually became Empress of Germany, though briefly. Her son would become Kaiser Wilhelm II, whose complicated relationship with his mother and his English heritage would have enormous consequences for Europe. But that's a story for later. Then came Bertie, Albert Edward, who would become King Edward III, and Bertie was a disaster. From his parents' perspective, he wasn't academic like his father wanted. He was charming and social, but lazy with his studies. He was more interested in parties and women than in duty and learning. Victoria and Albert pushed him hard, maybe too hard, trying to mold him into something he wasn't. That pressure would create problems that would eventually contribute to tragedy. After Bertie came Alice, who would marry into German royalty and become a champion of nursing and social causes. Then Alfred, who joined the Royal Navy and had a successful military career. Helena, who married a minor German prince and focused on charity work. Louise, who was artistic and independent and refused several marriage proposals before finally marrying a Scottish duke, the first British monarch's child to marry a subject, rather than royalty, since 1515. Arthur, who had a distinguished military career. Leopold, who inherited haemophilia from Victoria and died young after a fall at age 30. And finally Beatrice, the baby, who became Victoria's closest companion in later years. 9 children, 9 completely different personalities and life paths. Some thrived under Victoria and Albert's parenting approach. Others struggled against it, just like any family. But here's what Victoria never quite grasped, that having 9 children, being constantly pregnant, or recovering from childbirth, while also trying to rule an empire, was an almost impossible burden. She resented her pregnancies, resented her children for making her feel unwell, resented the loss of freedom that motherhood represented. But she also felt guilty about those feelings because wasn't she supposed to love every moment of motherhood? Wasn't that what women were supposed to do? The societal expectations around motherhood in the Victorian era were crushing. Women were supposed to be naturally maternal, naturally nurturing, naturally delighted by every aspect of child-rearing. If you weren't, if you struggled, if you found babies disgusting or pregnancy miserable, then something was wrong with you. You were unnatural, unfeminine, failed. Those same expectations exist today, don't they? We've just gotten more subtle about it. We share Instagram photos of glowing pregnant women and perfect nurseries and happy family moments. We talk about how blessed we are, how motherhood is the greatest gift. And all of that can be true for some women, some of the time, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth includes the exhaustion and the overwhelm and the moments when you're sobbing in the bathroom because you haven't slept in 3 days and the baby won't stop crying and you feel like you're failing at the one thing you're supposed to be naturally good at. The whole truth includes postpartum depression and anxiety and all the ways our bodies and minds struggle with the enormous biological and psychological demands of creating and caring for new life. Victoria lived that whole truth. She just couldn't talk about it publicly because she was the queen and queens were supposed to be above such struggles. But in her letters to her daughters, in her journal entries, in those moments when she dropped her guard, she was achingly honest about how hard she found motherhood. And there's something almost heroic about that honesty, even if she couldn't share it with the world. Albert, meanwhile, threw himself into being the father he'd never really had. His own father had been distant, more interested in mistresses than in his children. Albert was determined to be different. He spent time with his children every day, even when his schedule was packed with royal duties. He oversaw their education personally, hiring tutors and reviewing their progress. He played with them, took them on educational trips, taught them to ice skate and ride horses. Was he too demanding sometimes? Probably, especially with Bertie, where his expectations were impossibly high. But he was trying. He was present in a way that royal fathers typically weren't, and his children, even the ones who struggled under his expectations, never doubted that he loved them. The image the public saw was perfect. Victoria and Albert and their growing family, models of domestic happiness. The reality was messier. Victoria struggling with depression after each birth, Albert trying to balance supporting his wife with protecting their children from her volatile moods. Children being raised with love and privilege, but also with enormous pressure to live up to impossible standards. Arguments behind closed doors, moments of joy and connection mixed with moments of tension and pain. But isn't that every family? Isn't that the real story of parenthood? Not the Instagram version, but the 3 in the morning version, the I don't know if I'm doing this right version, the I love these humans so much it terrifies me version. Victoria and Albert were figuring it out as they went, just like every parent does. They made mistakes. They also did things remarkably well, given the pressures they faced. And through it all, they were building something, a family that, for all its complications and struggles, was bound together by genuine affection. Children who knew they were loved, even when they disappointed their parents. A partnership where 2 people supported each other through the hardest parts of life, even when they didn't always agree on how to handle things. But that partnership, that delicate balance they'd built between love and duty, between personal needs and public demands, between individual strengths and shared purpose, it was about to face its greatest test, because behind the scenes, tensions were building. Power struggles that had been simmering for years were about to boil over, and the question of who really controlled Victoria's life, Albert or Victoria herself, was about to become impossible to ignore. Behind every great love story, there's a power struggle, and Victoria and Albert's marriage was no exception. Here's something most people don't realize. For the first 2 years of their marriage, Victoria and Albert fought constantly. Not little disagreements, fierce, bitter arguments that sometimes lasted for days. Arguments about money, about influence, about who got to make decisions, about something that sounds trivial, but absolutely wasn't. Who controlled Victoria's household? Because there was a third person in their marriage. Her name was Baroness Louise Letson, and she'd been Victoria's governess since childhood. Leighton had been there through Victoria's isolated, controlled upbringing. She'd been Victoria's ally against her mother and Sir John Conroy when they tried to dominate her. She'd been Victoria's confidant when Victoria became queen at 18, with no one else to trust. For Victoria, Lesson wasn't just a servant. She was family. She was safety for Albert. Leon was the enemy. Think about it from Albert's perspective. He arrives in England as Victoria's husband, expecting to have some role in managing their household, their life together. That's what husbands did in 1840. That was the natural order of things. But Victoria's household was run by Leighton, who controlled everything from the daily schedule to which servants had, which responsibilities to when and what Victoria ate. Leighton had keys to all the rooms. She managed all the finances. She decided who could see Victoria and when, and Lexon made it crystal clear that she saw Albert as an intruder, someone trying to steal Victoria away from her, someone who couldn't be trusted. The battles over this got ugly. Really ugly. There's a famous incident from 1842 involving their eldest daughter, Vicky, who was about 2 years old at the time. Vicky had been sick, running a fever, not eating properly. Albert thought the nursery was too hot, that Vicky needed fresh air and a cooler environment. Leighton insisted the child needed to be kept warm and quiet. This wasn't just a disagreement about childcare. It was a proxy war for who had authority over Victoria's family. Albert went to Victoria and demanded that Lesson be removed from managing the nursery. Victoria refused. They fought about it for days. Victoria defended Elson with the same fierce loyalty she'd always shown. Albert saw this as Victoria choosing Letson over him, choosing the past over their future together. Have you ever been in a relationship where someone from your partner's past, an ex, a family member, a longtime friend seemed to come between you, where you felt like you were constantly competing for attention and influence? That's where Albert was. Except in his case, the person he was competing with had literally raised his wife and had Victoria's complete trust and devotion. It came to a head in September 1842. Albert gave Victoria an ultimatum. Either Letson goes or I cannot function in this marriage. And he didn't just say it in the heat of an argument. He put it in writing, a formal letter laying out all the ways Letson's presence was damaging their marriage, their children's well-being, and Victoria's effectiveness as queen. Victoria was torn apart. On one side was the woman who'd protected her through her difficult childhood, who'd never asked anything in return except to continue serving her. On the other side was her husband, whom she loved, the father of her children, her partner in ruling an empire. She chose Albert, and it nearly broke her heart to do it. Letleton was pensioned off, given a generous retirement package, and sent to Germany. Victoria wrote her heartbroken letters for years afterward. She never stopped feeling guilty about it, but she'd made her choice. Her marriage had to come first, even if it meant losing someone she considered family. And something shifted after that, something fundamental in the power dynamic between Victoria and Albert. See, for the first 2 years of their marriage, Victoria had been very clear. She was the queen and Albert was her husband. And those were two separate things. She made the final decisions on everything. She controlled the money. She determined what Albert could and couldn't do. When Albert wanted to reorganize the household accounts, which were an absolute mess, by the way, Victoria initially refused, because she saw it as him trying to control her. But after the Leighton situation, Victoria started to let go gradually, reluctantly, but definitively. She started trusting Albert with more decisions, started asking his opinion not as a courtesy, but because she genuinely wanted his counsel, started deferring to him on household matters, on children's education, on financial management, on social arrangements. By 1842, just 2 years into their marriage, Albert had become what he'd said he could never be, the master in the house, not through force or demands, but through patience and persistence, and proving himself indispensable. Here's what's fascinating about this from a modern perspective. Victoria essentially adopted the Victorian ideal of wheelie submission. Despite being queen, despite having more power than literally any other woman in the world, she chose to present herself publicly and privately as a dutiful, obedient wife who deferred to her husband's superior wisdom. And historians still debate whether this was genuine or performance. Did Victoria really see Albert as her superior, or did she strategically adopt that persona because it made their political partnership work more smoothly? I think the truth is somewhere in between. Victoria loved Albert. She admired his intelligence, his education, his calm rationality that balanced her emotional reactivity. She genuinely believed he was better equipped to handle certain aspects of governance than she was, but she also recognized that their partnership worked better when she wasn't constantly asserting her authority. When she let Albert feel like he had real power and influence in her letters, Victoria often referred to Albert as her lord and master. She wrote things like, "I am but a woman and need guidance." She presented herself as weak and dependent on Albert's strength. But, and this is crucial, she never actually gave up her constitutional authority as monarch. The final say on government matters was always legally and practically hers. She just chose to exercise that authority in consultation with Albert. It's a brilliant political move when you think about it. By publicly embracing traditional gender roles in her personal life, Victoria made herself more acceptable to a society that was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of female authority. "Look," she was saying, "I might be queen, but I'm still a proper woman who knows her husband is her superior. I'm not threatening the natural order of things, but behind closed doors, Behind closed doors, Victoria and Albert were building something more equal than that public image suggested. Yes, Albert had enormous influence. Yes, Victoria relied on him heavily, but she never became the passive, submissive figure she sometimes portrayed herself as. When they disagreed on important matters, she held her ground. When she felt strongly about a political decision, she made the choice she thought was right. Even if Albert disagreed, and they still fought. Oh, did they fight? Victoria's temper didn't disappear. Used because Elson was gone, she could still be volatile, emotional, sometimes cruel in anger. And Albert had his own stubborn streak, his own moments of frustration and resentment. There's a story from the late 1840s. I wish I could tell you the exact date, but the sources are vague, where Victoria and Albert had such a fierce argument that Albert retreated to his private rooms and locked the door. Victoria followed him, pounding on the door, demanding he let her in. "Who is it?" Albert called through the door. "The Queen of England," Victoria shouted back. "Silence!" Albert didn't open the door. Victoria knocked again. "Who is it?" Albert repeated. "This time," Victoria said, more quietly, "Your wife." And Albert opened the door. Now I've seen that story told as romantic. Look how Albert taught Victoria humility. Taught her that in their marriage she needed to be a wife first and a queen second. But I think it's more complicated than that, because Albert was essentially forcing Victoria to choose in that moment between her identity as monarch and her identity as his partner. He was saying, "Your authority as queen means nothing to me if you're not also willing to be vulnerable as my wife." That's a lot to demand, isn't it? Especially from someone whose entire sense of security and safety was bound up in her role as queen. Victoria had spent her childhood powerless. The crown gave her power, agency, control over her own life. And Albert was asking her to willingly set that aside, to be just his wife, to be the less powerful person in the relationship. The fact that she did it, that she chose to knock again and identify herself as his wife, rather than walking away, tells you how much she loved him. But it also tells you the cost of that love. Every time Victoria chose Albert over her own authority, she was giving up a piece of the independence she'd fought so hard to claim. And yet, paradoxically, their relationship worked better for it. The more Victoria allowed Albert to lead in their personal life, the more effectively they functioned as a political partnership. It's like they found a balance. Victoria held the constitutional power, but Albert wielded the practical influence. Victoria made the final decisions, but Albert shaped those decisions through advice and persuasion. Victoria wore the crown, but Albert was the architect of how that crown was used. And by the 1850s, 10 years into their marriage, this system had become so established that foreign dignitaries and British politicians routinely met with Albert before meeting with Victoria. They knew that to influence Victoria, they needed to convince Albert first. Some ministers even complained about it, arguing that Albert was exercising power without being accountable to Parliament or the people. But Victoria didn't care. As far as she was concerned, Albert's role was her choice to grant, and she trusted him completely. Here's what I find most remarkable. They managed to create a marriage that was both revolutionary and deeply traditional at the same time. Revolutionary because Victoria, as a female monarch, should have held all the power, and instead she chose to share it with her husband in ways that went far beyond what was constitutionally required. Traditional because they ultimately settled into gender dynamics that looked a lot like any Victorian marriage. Husband as decision-maker, wife as supporter and nurturer. Was this feminist? Was Victoria betraying her own power by deferring to Albert so completely? Or was she actually exercising the ultimate form of power, the power to choose how much authority to delegate and to whom? I honestly don't know the answer. I think different people will see it differently, depending on their own experiences and values. What I do know is the Victoria and Albert figured out how to make their marriage work despite impossible circumstances. A reigning queen married to a man with no constitutional power, a woman who craved both independence and partnership, a man who needed to feel useful and respected, but who would always legally be subordinate to his wife. They could have let those contradictions destroy their marriage. They could have spent 20 years locked in constant power struggles, making each other miserable. Instead, they found a way to build something functional, and by most accounts genuinely loving. But, and this is important, it only worked because both of them were willing to compromise. Victoria had to give up some of her jealously guarded independence. Albert had to accept that he would never have official recognition of his role, never have the titles and authority that his actual influence deserved. They both had to be flexible enough, patient enough, and committed enough to keep negotiating and renegotiating the terms of their partnership. And sometimes they just had to agree to disagree and move on. Not every fight got resolved. Not every tension got released. Marriage isn't about fixing everything. It's about deciding what's worth fighting for and what's worth letting go. It's about choosing each other, even when you're angry, even when you're frustrated, even when you're absolutely certain the other person is wrong about something. Victoria and Albert figured that out. It took them years, and there were moments when it seemed like they might not make it. But they did. They built a marriage that was messy and complicated and sometimes infuriating for both of them, and also deeply loving, genuinely respectful, and remarkably effective. And just when they'd finally found their rhythm, just when they'd figured out how to balance power and partnership, independence and intimacy, duty and desire, just when everything was working, fate was about to deliver a blow that would test everything they'd built. Because the greatest challenge to their marriage wasn't going to be the battles they fought with each other. It was going to be the battles they'd have to fight side by side. And what was coming would show them exactly what their partnership was made of. What do you do when you're living in the most conservative institution on earth, the monarchy, during one of history's most revolutionary periods? When the world around you is changing faster than anyone can keep up with, when steam engines are replacing horses, when telegraphs are making instant communication possible, when entire ways of life that had existed for centuries are disappearing almost overnight, if you're Victoria and Albert, you embrace it. You lean into the change. You become champions of progress. This is something people often miss about Victoria and Albert's partnership. They weren't just ruling during the Industrial Revolution. They were actively participating in it, promoting it, using their platform to push Britain toward the future. And a lot of that drive came from Albert, who was absolutely obsessed with science and technology in a way that was unusual for royalty. Most monarchs of that era saw science as something beneath them, something for academics and merchants to worry about. But Albert had studied at the University of Bonn, where he'd been exposed to cutting-edge thinking about chemistry, physics, economics, social reform. He understood that the world was changing, and he believed the monarchy needed to change with it or risk becoming irrelevant. So Albert started doing something radical. He started bringing the future into the royal homes. Let me paint you a picture of what the average British home looked like in the 1840s, even wealthy homes. You lit your rooms, wit, H candles or oil lamps. You heated with fireplaces. If you needed to send a message to someone across town, you sent a servant on foot or on horseback. Communication between cities took days or weeks. The way people lived in 1840 wasn't that different from how people had lived in 1740 or even 1640. Now let me tell you about Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace under Albert's influence. They had electric lighting, not everywhere because the technology was still new and unreliable, but in key rooms powered by early generators. They had the electric telegraph installed, which meant Victoria could send and receive messages from government ministers almost instantaneously. No more waiting days for important news from distant parts of the empire. The telegraph made real-time governance possible. Think about what that meant politically. Before the telegraph, if there was a crisis in India or Canada or Australia, By the time news reached London, the situation might have changed completely. Decisions were always made on old information, but with the telegraph, Victoria and her ministers could respond to events as they were happening. It fundamentally transformed how Britain governed its empire, and Albert was the one pushing for this technology to be adopted. He saw immediately what it could do, while traditionalists in government were worried about the cost or the reliability or the strange new-fangled nature of it all. Albert was saying, "This is the future. We need to embrace it now, not wait until everyone else has already figured it out." But it wasn't just about technology for technology's sake. Albert believed deeply that innovation should serve human welfare, that progress should make people's lives better, not just more complicated or more profitable for industrialists. One of Albert's great passions was education reform, and this gets to something really important, about how he saw the world. Albert believed that education should be available to everyone, not just the wealthy, that working-class children deserved schools, that women deserved education equal to men's. These were genuinely radical ideas in 184. The British education system at that time was a mess. If you were wealthy, you could afford private tutors, or send your sons and only your sons to elite schools. If you were middle class, there were some grammar schools, though the quality varied wildly. If you were working class, you were mostly out of luck. Some churches ran charity schools, but they were overcrowded and underfunded. The vast majority of British children received little or no formal education. Albert started using his influence to change that. He became patron of multiple educational societies. He gave speeches advocating for universal education. He helped establish scholarship funds so talented children from poor families could attend good schools. He supported the expansion of technical colleges where working-class men could learn trades and skills that would help them succeed in the new industrial economy. And here's what made Albert's approach so effective. He didn't just give speeches and donate money, he visited these schools personally. He met with students and teachers, he asked questions about what was working and what wasn't. He actually cared about the details of implementation, not just the grand vision. There's a story about Albert visiting a mechanics institute, essentially a technical school for working-class men learning skilled trades. The administrators were nervous, trying to show him only the most successful students, the cleanest workshops, but Albert insisted on seeing everything: the struggling students, the equipment that was broken or outdated, the cramped classrooms. He wanted to understand the real challenges, not just see a sanitized version prepared for royal inspection. And then he went back to London and lobbied for funding to help fix those problems. He used his access to wealthy industrialists and politicians to get resources directed to these schools. He made education reform fashionable among the elite by demonstrating his own commitment to it. Albert also championed something that seems obvious now, but was controversial then: the idea that education should include practical skills, not just classical subjects. The traditional British education system for the upper classes was all Greek and Latin, history and literature, useful for producing gentlemen scholars, not so useful for a world that needed engineers and scientists and skilled manufacturers. Albert pushed for science education, for technical training, for subjects that would help Britain maintain its economic leadership in an industrializing world. And he modeled this with his own children. Remember the Swiss cottage at Osborne House, where the royal children learned gardening and carpentry and cooking. Albert practicing what he preached, even with his own family. But education wasn't Albert's only cause. He was also a passionate advocate for the abolition of slavery worldwide. Now, Britain had abolished the slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery throughout most of the British Empire in 1833, before Victoria even became queen. But slavery still existed in other parts of the world, including the United States, Brazil, parts of Africa, and Asia. Albert used every opportunity he had to speak against slavery and the slave trade. He gave speeches at anti-slavery societies. He met with abolitionists from other countries, and offered them royal support and encouragement. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Albert was firmly on the side of the Union, seeing the war partly as a moral struggle over slavery. Though he also urged court eye on Britain's diplomatic approach because he didn't want Britain dragged into the conflict militarily, there's actually evidence that Albert helped prevent Britain from intervening on the side of the Confederacy. The British textile industry depended heavily on cotton from the American South, and there was significant pressure from British manufacturers to recognize the Confederacy and help break the Confederacy and help break the Union blockade so cotton could flow again. But Albert argued that supporting the Confederacy would put Britain on the wrong side of history, would align Britain with the cause of slavery. His influence helped keep Britain neutral, which probably helped the Union ultimately win the war. And then there was Albert's work on social reform within Britain itself. He was appalled by the living conditions in Britain's rapidly growing industrial cities. Workers crammed into slums with no sanitation, no clean water, diseases spreading like wildfire, child labor in factories and mines, working hours that literally worked people to death. Albert couldn't change all of this. The monarchy didn't have that kind of direct power over domestic policy, but he could draw attention to these problems. He could visit workers' housing and let the newspapers report on how shocked he was by the conditions. He could champion model housing projects that showed how working-class homes could be built more safely and hygienically. He could use his presidency of the society for improving the condition of the laboring classes to promote better housing standards and workplace protections. Was it enough? No. Was it more than most royals of that era even thought to attempt? Absolutely. Here's what I find beautiful about Albert's approach to all of this. He genuinely believed that the monarchy's role was to serve the people, not the other way around. That having privilege and position meant having responsibility to make things better. That you couldn't just enjoy the wealth and prestige of royalty without giving back, without using your influence for good. And Victoria supported all of this. She attended these events with Albert, listened to his speeches about education and social reform, met with the people he brought to palace to discuss various causes. She let Albert use the monarchy's platform for these purposes. She validated his work with her presence and approval. Together they transformed what it meant to be royal in the modern age. They showed that monarchy could be compatible with progress, with democracy, with social reform, that kings and queens didn't have to be distant, removed figures concerned only with ceremony and tradition. They could be engaged with the real problems of their time, could use their influence to push society forward. Think about the innovations that became standard in royal life under Victoria and Albert's influence. Regular royal visits to factories, hospitals, schools, connecting the monarchy with ordinary people's lives. Royal patronage of charitable organizations, using the prestige of royal association to raise funds and awareness for important causes. Making the royal family visible through photography and public appearances, demonstrating that royals were real people with values and commitments, not just symbols. This was the model that future British monarchs would follow. Queen Elizabeth II, for example, with her hundreds of patronages, her visits to communities throughout Britain and the Commonwealth, her careful maintenance of the monarchy's relevance, by connecting it to social causes and public service. She was following the template that Victoria and Albert created. But here's what often gets lost in discussions of Albert's achievements. All of this work was exhausting. Albert was essentially doing the job of a full-time monarch without any of the constitutional authority or public recognition that came with that role. He was prince consort in everything but name. For most of his life, remember, Victoria didn't formally grant him that title until 1857, 17 years into their marriage. He worked constantly, morning meetings reviewing government papers, afternoon visits to schools or hospitals or industrial sites, evening receptions with foreign dignitaries, late nights writing speeches or correspondence or memoranda on various policy issues. He rarely took time off. He rarely relaxed. His health started to suffer from the pace he was keeping. Chronic stomach problems, recurring bouts of illness that he just pushed through because there was always more work to do. Victoria worried about him. She could see he was wearing himself down, but Albert couldn't seem to stop. Maybe because he felt he had to prove himself to justify his position. Maybe because he genuinely cared too much about too many things to prioritize. Maybe because he knew on some level that his influence was borrowed, that it existed only because Victoria granted it, and if he stopped being useful, stopped being indispensable, that influence might disappear. There's something both admirable and tragic about that level of dedication. Albert achieved so much. He genuinely made Britain and the world better through his work. But at what cost to himself? At what cost to his health, his well-being, his ability to simply enjoy life? This is the dark side of the Victorian work ethic that Albert embodied so completely. The idea that your worth is measured by your productivity, your accomplishments, your usefulness, that rest is laziness, that self-care is selfishness, that you should push yourself to the limit and then push some more because there's always more work to be done, always more problems to solve, always more ways you could be better or do more. Sound familiar? How many of us are living that same way right now? Pushing ourselves too hard, working too much, unable to rest, because we're afraid of falling behind or not being enough or losing the position we've worked so hard to achieve. Albert was brilliant. He was dedicated. He was genuinely good in a world where powerful people often aren't, but he was also running himself into the ground, and everyone around him could see it happening. By the late 1850s, by the time he reached his 40th birthday, people who knew him well were worried. He looked exhausted. He was sick more often. He seemed to have aged beyond his years. Victoria begged him to slow down, to take more time at Balmoral or Osborne, their private retreats, where he could theoretically relax. But Albert couldn't really relax anymore. Even at their holiday homes, he was redesigning gardens, planning building projects, corresponding about various initiatives and causes. His mind never stopped working, and lurking in the background of all this frenetic activity was a question nobody wanted to ask. What would happen if Albert couldn't do this anymore? What would Victoria do without him? What would happen to all these causes and initiatives and innovations if Albert wasn't there to champion them? The monarchy had become dependent on Albert in ways that went far beyond what anyone had anticipated. He'd made himself essential, not just to Victoria personally, but to the entire functioning of the modern British monarchy. The system they'd built together worked beautifully as long as both of them were there to maintain it. But systems built around specific people are always fragile, always vulnerable. And though nobody knew it yet, though everyone assumed Albert would be there for decades to come, guiding Victoria and Britain into the future, time was running out much faster than anyone imagined, because the innovations Albert and Victoria had championed, the progress they'd fostered, the modern world they'd helped create, all of it was about to collide with something very old and very human, mortality. And when that collision came, it would shatter everything they'd built and leave Victoria facing a question she'd never had to answer before. Who was she without Albert? Could she rule without him? Could she even survive without him? The answer to those questions was waiting just around the corner, and it would be more complicated, more painful, and ultimately more Rivoli than anyone could have predicted. February 10th, 1861, 21 years to the day since Victoria and Albert had stood together in that chapel. Since she'd worn that revolutionary white dress, since they'd promised forever to each other. 21 years of marriage, 9 children, countless challenges overcome, and they'd made it work. Not perfectly, but genuinely. They'd built something real. Victoria commissioned a photograph to commemorate their 21st anniversary. In it, Albert stands tall beside Victoria, who's seated. She's looking up at him with an expression that's hard to read. Pride, certainly, but also something like contentment. Albert looks older than his 41 years. A bit tired, maybe, but still handsome, still dignified. Their grandparents, now their eldest daughter, Vicky, had given birth to the future Kaiser Wilhelm II back in 1859. Victoria wrote to her uncle Leopold, expressing deep satisfaction with her marriage. She wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here because the full quote is quite long, that very few people could say that after 21 years their husband was still full of friendship, kindness, and affection, that she was blessed beyond measure. Everything seemed stable, secure. They'd weathered so many storms together, political crises, personal conflicts, the challenge of raising 9 children while ruling an empire. They were hitting their stride. Albert's great exhibition was a decade in the past, but still celebrated. His innovations and reforms were bearing fruit. Victoria had learned to share power gracefully. They'd found their rhythm. And then Bertie ruined everything. Bertie Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the throne, was 20 years old in 1861. And he was everything his parents feared. He might become charming but unfocused, sociable but undisciplined, more interested in pleasure than duty. Despite all of Albert's careful education plans, all the tutors and supervision, and attempts to mold Bertie into a future king, the young man had turned out, well, not badly exactly, but disappointingly, at least from his parents' perspective. Victoria and Albert had sent Bertie to do military training with the Grenadier Guards stationed at the Curragh camp in Ireland. They hoped military discipline would mature him, give him focus and purpose. Instead, Bertie's fellow officers decided to play a prank. They smuggled an actress named Nellie Clifton into Bertie's quarters one night, and the prank turned into an affair that lasted several weeks before someone finally told Bertie's superiors, who then had the unenviable task of informing the Queen and Prince Consort that their heir was sleeping with an actress. Now, to be clear, royal men having affairs was hardly unprecedented. Victoria's uncles had been notorious for their mistresses. European courts were full of illegitimate royal children. This was almost expected behavior for princes, but Victoria and Albert had built their entire reputation on moral uprightness, on domestic virtue, on being different from all those scandalous royals who'd come before. They'd preached propriety and duty and self-control, and now their own son, their heir, was proving that all their careful instruction and modelling might have been for nothing. Albert was devastated. Not just disappointed, devastated. He took it as a personal failure. All those years of education, all that time spent trying to prepare Bertie to be a good king and a good man, and this was the result. Albert worried about scandal. Yes. What if Nellie Clifton got pregnant? What if she went to the newspapers? What if this destroyed everything they'd built? But more than the practical concerns, Albert seemed to take Bertie's behavior as a moral betrayal. Like Bertie had rejected everything Albert stood for, everything Albert had tried to teach him about duty and honor and self-control. Victoria was equally furious, but she directed most of her anger at Nellie Clifton, calling her that wretched woman in her letters. Because, of course, it was the woman's fault, right? That's how Victorian morality worked. Men were victims of female temptation, not responsible agents making their own choices. Never mind that Bertie had been a willing participant. Never mind that he'd continued the affair for weeks. The actress was the villain in Victoria's mind. On November 25, 1861, Albert decided he needed to confront Bertie personally. He travelled to Cambridge, where Bertie was now stationed. The weather was terrible. Cold, rainy, miserable, late November in England. Albert was already feeling unwell when he left. He'd been sick on and off all year, dealing with stomach problems and general fatigue. But he insisted on going. This was too important to delegate. Father and son had a long, difficult conversation. Walking through Cambridge in the rain, Albert trying to make Bertie understand the seriousness of what he'd done, the potential consequences, the disappointment he'd caused. Bertie, for his part, was appropriately contrite. He apologized, promised to do better, showed genuine remorse, and Albert, being Albert, forgave him or tried to. He wrote to Victoria afterward that he thought Bertie understood, now that perhaps this crisis would be the making of the young man. But Albert returned from Cambridge sicker than when he'd left. The cold, the rain, the stress of the confrontation, the emotional toll of feeling like he'd failed as a father, it all took something out of him. He complained of feeling exhausted, of stomach pains that were worse than usual, of not being able to sleep properly, and he didn't recover. Days turned into a week into 2 weeks, and Albert just kept getting sicker. Doctors were called, the best physicians available. They examined him, prescribed various treatments, but nothing seemed to help. Victoria watched her husband deteriorate, watched him go from tired to genuinely ill to frighteningly weak, and she was terrified. By early December, Albert was mostly bedridden. He couldn't work at his desk anymore, couldn't attend meetings, could barely get through a day without collapsing from exhaustion. The doctors began whispering a diagnosis: typhoid fever. Typhoid. In 1861, that was essentially a death sentence. There was no cure, no effective treatment. You either survived it or you didn't, and plenty of people didn't. The mortality rate was something like 20%. 1 in 5 people who contracted typhoid died from it. Victoria refused to believe it. She couldn't believe it. Albert was only 42 years old. 42, that's not old. People didn't just die at 42. Not people like Albert, who'd always been healthy and strong and capable. This was just a bad illness, a temporary setback. He'd recover. He had to recover, but Albert knew, somehow he knew. On December 13th, he asked to see his children, all of them. He was too weak to sit up properly, so they came to his bedside. He spoke to each of them, though his voice was barely above a whisper. He gave them his blessings, his advice, his low, "Boy." He told them to be good, to take care of their mother, to remember everything he'd taught them about duty and service. Victoria watched this scene and still couldn't accept what it meant. This wasn't goodbye. This couldn't be goodbye. They were supposed to have decades more together. They were supposed to have decades more together. They were supposed to have 21 years. They were supposed to have 21 more, 30 more. However long it took until they were old and grey and ready to leave this world together. December 14th, 1861, 10:45 at night. In the Blue Room at Windsor Castle, with Victoria holding his hand, Albert took his last breath. Dr. William Jenner, who diagnosed the typhoid, officially recorded the time of death. 42 years old, 21 years of marriage, gone. Victoria's scream when she realized he was dead could be heard throughout the castle. It wasn't a cry or a sob. It was a primal animal scream of anguish, the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. In the days that followed, Victoria wrote to her uncle, Leopold. Her words captured the absolute devastation she felt to be cut off in the prime of life, to see our pure, happy, quiet, domestic life, which alone enabled me to bear my much disliked position, cut off at 42, when I had hoped with such instinctive certainty that God never would part us. Let's pause there. Our pure, happy, quiet domestic life, which alone enabled me to bear my much disliked position. Victoria had been queen for almost 24 years by this point, and she still described her position, being queen of the most powerful empire on earth, as much disliked. The only thing that had made it bearable was Albert, their partnership, their love, their shared life. And now that was gone, ripped away without warning. And she was supposed to just continue being queen. How? Victoria blamed Bertie. In her grief and rage, she fixated on the timeline. Albert had been fine until he went to Cambridge. He'd gotten sick after dealing with Bertie's scandal. Therefore, Bertie had killed his father. It was Bertie's fault. That dreadful business, as she called it, had killed Albert. Now, medically speaking, this made no sense. Typhoid fever has an incubation period of 1 to 3 weeks. If Albert had contracted typhoid, it would have been from contaminated water or food, probably sometime in November before he went to Cambridge. The scandal and the trip didn't cause the illness, but grief doesn't care about medical facts. Victoria needed someone to blame, and Bertie was convenient. He disappointed them, betrayed their values, caused stress and worry at exactly the wrong time. So in Victoria's mind, he'd killed his father. The relationship between Victoria and Bertie never fully recovered. Even years later, even after Bertie became King Edward III and actually turned out to be a pretty decent monarch, Victoria never quite forgave him for what she saw as his role in Albert's death. Imagine living with that. Imagine losing your father and having your mother blame you for his death for the rest of your life. But here's where the story gets even more tragic. Albert probably didn't die of typhoid at all. Modern historians and medical experts who've reviewed the evidence, Albert's symptoms throughout 1861, the progression of his final illness, the descriptions of his condition, most of them think the typhoid diagnosis was wrong. Albert had been complaining of stomach problems for months before he died. Chronic abdominal pain, difficulty eating, recurring nausea. That's not typhoid. Typhoid comes on suddenly, but it is consistent with stomach cancer, or Crohn's disease, or some other chronic gastrointestinal condition that was slowly killing him throughout 1861, while everyone, including Albert himself, tried to push through it and keep working. Think about what this means. Albert might have been dying all year, getting progressively sicker, his body slowly failing, and he just kept working, kept pushing himself, kept taking on more responsibilities and projects and causes, because that's who he was. He couldn't stop, he couldn't rest. Even when his body was literally breaking down, even when he must have felt terrible, he kept going. And then the stress of Bertie's scandal, the exhausting trip to Cambridge in terrible weather, the emotional toll of feeling like he'd failed as a father. That might have been the final push that sent his failing body over the edge. Not the cause of his death, but the trigger that accelerated what was already happening. If that's true, and we'll never know for certain, but it seems likely, then Albert essentially worked himself to death. The Victorian work ethic that he embodied so perfectly, that drive to be productive and useful and accomplished at all costs, literally killed him. He never learned to rest. He never learned to prioritize his own health over his duties. He never learned that being enough didn't mean doing everything. Does that sound familiar? How many people do you know right now who are running themselves into the ground? Who can't take a break because there's always more work to do? Who measure their worth by their productivity and their usefulness? Who would rather die than be seen as lazy or inadequate or not enough? We're still living out Albert's tragic example. We're still killing ourselves with the same work ethic that killed him. And we call it ambition, dedication, commitment. We praise it. We build entire careers and companies around it. We reward people who sacrifice their health and well-being for productivity. But look where it led. Albert dead at 42. Victoria shattered, grief-stricken, lost, 9 children without their father. An entire nation in mourning for a prince who'd been mocked and dismissed when he arrived, but had become beloved through his tireless work and dedication. All of Albert's causes and projects suddenly without their champion. The partnership that had made the monarchy work suddenly broken, leaving Victoria to figure out how to rule alone after 21 years of shared authority. In the immediate aftermath of Albert's death, Victoria couldn't function. She stayed in her rooms crying, refusing to see anyone except her closest ladies-in-waiting. She wrote letters obsessively to family members, to friends, to Albert himself, as if he could still read them. She clung to anything that had been his clothes, his papers, his personal belongings. She had his rooms kept exactly as they'd been, as if he might come back at any moment. The government didn't know what to do. They needed the Queen to sign documents, to make decisions, to fulfill her constitutional duties. But Victoria was too grief-stricken to care about any of that. For the first time since she'd become queen 24 years earlier, she was completely non-functional. The empire that had depended on the Victoria-Albert partnership was suddenly rudderless, and Victoria herself faced an existential question. Who was she without Albert? For 21 years her identity had been built around their partnership. She was queen, yes, but she was Albert's wife first. She'd defined herself through their relationship, through their shared work, through the life they'd built together. She'd literally written that being queen was bearable only because of our pure, happy, quiet, domestic life. So now what? Albert was gone. Their domestic life was gone, and she was still queen. Still had all these responsibilities, still had an empire to help govern. But the thing that had made it all bearable, the thing that had given it meaning, that was gone forever. Have you ever lost someone who was fundamental to who you are? Not just someone you loved, but someone whose presence in your life was woven into your very identity. Where their loss doesn't just leave a hole, it leaves you wondering if you even exist anymore without them. That's where Victoria was on December 14th, 1861, and in the days and weeks that followed. And what she would do with that grief, how she would rebuild herself, or fail to rebuild herself, would define the rest of her long life, and would ultimately transform what the British monarchy meant and could be. But in those first raw days and weeks, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the pain, the unbearable, crushing, suffocating pain of loving someone so deeply for so long, and then having them ripped away without warning, and the terrible knowledge that life had to go on somehow, even though the person who'd made life worth living was gone forever. Black. That's the color Victoria chose, and it became the only color she would wear for the next 40 years. 40 years. Think about that for a moment. If you started wearing only black today, you'd still be wearing black in 2065. Your entire life would pass. Relationships beginning and ending, careers rising and falling, children growing up and having children of their own. And every single day you'd wake up and put on black. Every single day you'd be announcing to the world, I am in mourning. I have lost someone. I will never stop grieving. That was Victoria's choice after Albert died. And it wasn't just about the clothes, though the black was certainly dramatic. It was about creating an entire life around absence, around loss, around the person who wasn't there anymore. Let me tell you what Victoria's mourning looked like in practice, because it went far beyond what anyone, even in grief-obsessed Victorian England, considered normal or healthy. First, Albert's rooms in every royal residence, Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, Osborne House, Balmoral, Albert's private rooms were kept exactly as they'd been on the day he died. His papers were left on his desk, arranged just as he'd left them. His clothes hung in his wardrobes, his personal items, his shaving kit, his hairbrushes, his pocket watches remained on his dressing table as if he might walk in at any moment and use them. But here's where it gets truly haunting. Victoria ordered her servants to maintain these rooms as if Albert was still alive. Every morning, fresh hot water for shaving was brought to his rooms and placed in the basin. Every day his linens and towels were changed. The fireplaces were lit in winter to keep the rooms warm. It was like maintaining a shrine, except the shrine was pretending the person wasn't actually dead. Can you imagine being a servant tasked with this? Every morning, carrying hot water to a dead man's room, carefully arranging towels that no one would use, maintaining the fiction that at any moment Prince Albert might return and need his things. It must have been deeply unsettling. But Victoria insisted on it, and she kept this practice going for the remaining 40 years of her life. At night, Victoria took Albert's dressing gown to bed with her. She would hold it, sleep with it beside her, as if having something that had touched his skin could somehow keep him close. She also kept a plaster cast of Albert's hand on her nightstand so she could reach out in the dark and touch it, imagining she was still holding his hand. Now, before we judge this too harshly, let's acknowledge something. Grief makes us do strange things. We keep our loved ones' clothes because they still smell like them. We leave voicemails, saved, because we can't bear to delete the sound of their voice. We visit graves and talk to headstones as if the person can hear us. Victoria's behaviors were an extreme version of what many grieving people do. She just had the resources to take it much, much further than most people can. But Victoria didn't stop at private mourning rituals. She withdrew from public life almost completely. For the first 5 years after Albert's death, from 1861 to 1866, Victoria barely appeared in public at all. She wouldn't attend Parliament openings. She wouldn't host state dinners or receptions. She refused most ceremonial duties. She basically disappeared from London, spending most of her time at Windsor, Osborne, or Balmoral, her private estates, where she could avoid public scrutiny. She did continue her official government work, reading papers, signing documents, meeting with ministers when absolutely necessary. She was still functioning as a constitutional monarch in that sense, but all the visible parts of being queen, all the ways the monarchy connected with ordinary people, all of that stopped. Victoria became known as the Widow of Windsor, a ghost haunting her castles, invisible to her people, present only as an absence. Initially, the British public was sympathetic. They understood grief. They'd lost people too, and they'd loved Albert by the end. His great exhibition, his charitable work, his obvious dedication to Britain, despite being German. So when Victoria withdrew to mourn, people said, "Give her time. She suffered a terrible loss. She deserves space to grieve." But 1 year became 2, 2 became 5, 5 became 10. And people started asking, when is she coming back? When will we have a queen again, not just a widow? By the late 1860s, sympathy was turning to frustration. Newspapers started publishing critical articles. Political commentators questioned whether Victoria was still fit to rule if she refused to do any of the public-facing parts of the job. Republican movements, people arguing that Britain should abolish the monarchy and become a republic, started gaining traction. Not a lot of traction, but more than had existed in decades. The crisis point came in 1871 when a pamphlet was published called "What Does She Do With It?" The pamphlet laid out in detail how much money Parliament paid to support the royal family, and it asked quite pointedly what exactly the British people were getting in return for that expense. Victoria wasn't appearing in public. She wasn't performing ceremonies. She was just sitting in her castles, mourning and collecting her allowance from the taxpayers. Was that really worth the cost? The pamphlet circulated widely. It was discussed in Parliament. It became a genuine political controversy. For the first time since early in Victoria's reign, there was serious question about whether the monarchy itself might be in danger, not from foreign invasion or political revolution, from irrelevance, from a queen who'd made herself invisible and seemed to have forgotten that monarchy survives only as long as the people believe it serves a purpose. Victoria's response to this crisis was complicated. Part of her didn't care. She wrote in her letters that the public didn't understand what she'd lost, that they had no right to demand she perform for them like some sort of circus animal. She'd lost her beloved husband, her partner, her anchor. How dare people expect her to just put on a smile and wave from balconies, as if nothing had happened? But another part of Victoria understood the danger. She had children and grandchildren whose futures depended on the monarchy's survival. She had a legacy to protect, hers and Albert's, so she made some concessions. She started appearing in public slightly more often, though still rarely. She allowed more photographs and engravings of herself to be distributed, maintaining her visibility even when she wasn't physically present. And crucially, she began building monuments to Albert, permanent public expressions of her grief that also served to remind people of Albert's contributions and to associate the monarchy with progress and cultural achievement. The Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, completed in 1876, is extraordinary. It's a Gothic revival monument, designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott, featuring a 14-feet bronze statue of Albert, seated and holding the catalogue of the Great Exhibition. He's surrounded by elaborate sculptural groups representing the continents, the sciences, the arts, agriculture, manufacturing. The whole structure is 175 feet tall and covered in precious materials, gold leaf, mosaic, semi-precious stones. It reportedly cost £120,000, roughly £15 million in today's money. It's beautiful. It's also almost aggressively ornate, overwhelming in its grief, made physical. Standing in front of it, you can feel the weight of Victoria's loss pressing down on you. This isn't a simple memorial. It's an argument made in stone and gold, saying, "Look what we lost. Look what he was. Look what Britain lost when he died." Then there's the Royal Albert Hall, opened in 1871. Victoria named it after Albert and dedicated it to furthering the arts and sciences that he championed. At the opening ceremony, Victoria was supposed to give a speech, but became too emotional to speak. She stood there in front of thousands of people, unable to say the words she'd prepared, because the grief was still so fresh, even 10 years after Albert's death. These monuments achieved something important. They kept Albert's memory alive publicly, but they also gave Victoria's grief a socially acceptable outlet. Instead of just sitting in her rooms holding Albert's dressing gown, she was commissioning memorials, establishing institutions, creating lasting legacies. It transformed her mourning from purely personal to at least partly public, from self-indulgent to culturally productive. But here's the question historians and psychologists have debated for over a century. Was Victoria's 40 years of mourning really about love? Or was it about guilt? Think about their relationship. All those fights in the early years, Victoria's volatile temper and emotional outbursts, the times she prioritized Letson over Albert, the way she relied on him for everything by the end, making him work himself literally to death. Did Victoria mourn so excessively because she loved Albert so much, or because she felt guilty about how their relationship had been, because she knew on some level that she'd been complicit in his death through her demands and dependence? There's evidence for both interpretations. Victoria's letters and journals after Albert's death are full of genuine expressions of love and loss. She writes about how empty her life feels without him, how nothing has meaning anymore, how she's just going through the motions of existence, waiting to be reunited with him in death. That sounds like profound love and grief, but there's also guilt woven through everything. She blames herself for not recognizing how sick Albert was sooner. She obsesses over their last conversations, analyzing whether she said the right things, whether she showed enough appreciation for him while he was alive. She writes about how unworthy she was of him, how he was an angel and she was just a flawed, difficult woman who didn't deserve his patience and devotion. And then there's the rage at Bertie, which reads less like grief and more like displaced guilt. By blaming Bertie for causing Albert's death through his scandal, Victoria didn't have to confront her own role in Albert's exhaustion and illness. She could be angry at Bertie instead of at herself, could direct all that complicated emotion outward instead of inward. The truth is probably that Victoria's mourning was motivated by both love and guilt, mixed together in ways that even she couldn't untangle. She genuinely loved Albert and grieved his loss. She also felt guilty about the dynamics of their relationship, about how much she'd demanded of him, about not protecting him better. And the guilt amplified the grief, made it harder to process and move through, kept her stuck in those first raw months of loss for literally the rest of her life. Because here's what's crucial to understand. Victoria never progressed through grief in any normal sense. She never reached acceptance. She never rebuilt her life in a way that honored Albert's memory, but also acknowledged that she was still alive and had to keep living. She essentially stopped her emotional development on December 14th, 1861, and stayed frozen there for 40 years. Psychologists today would probably diagnose Victoria with complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, a condition where grief doesn't ease over time but instead becomes chronic and disabling. The symptoms include intense yearning for the deceased person, difficulty accepting the death, feeling that life is meaningless without them, avoiding reminders of the loss, or conversely becoming obsessively focused on reminders. Victoria checked all these boxes, and Victorian culture enabled this, because in the 19th century, especially in Britain, mourning was ritualized to an extraordinary degree. There were strict rules about how long you should wear black after losing different family members. A full 2 years for a husband, for example, before you could even start incorporating grey or purple into your wardrobe. There were rules about what kind of jewelry was acceptable during mourning. Jet dark stones, hair jewelry made from the deceased person's hair. There were rules about social activities, about when you could attend raties, or go to the theatre, about what was respectful and what wasn't. This elaborate mourning culture was meant to provide structure for grief, to give people a socially sanctioned way to express loss. But it could also enable excessive grief, make it harder for people to move on because the culture kept insisting they demonstrate their sadness visibly and continuously. Victoria took Victorian mourning culture to its absolute extreme and then stayed there permanently. She wore black for 40 years. She never stopped observing the rituals. She never moved past the first acute phase of grief into something more sustainable. And because she was the queen, her behavior set the tone for the entire culture. Victorian mourning became even more elaborate and intense during Victoria's widowhood, partly because people were following her example. There's something both moving and troubling about this. Moving because Victoria's devotion to Albert's memory is genuine and powerful. This was real love, whatever else it was. Troubling because her inability to move forward limited her own life so dramatically. She was 42 when Albert died. She lived another 40 years. That's a whole lifetime's worth of experiences, relationships, growth, that she essentially refused to allow herself because moving forward felt like betraying Albert. What could Victoria have accomplished in those 40 years if she hadn't been so consumed by grief? What could she have enjoyed? What relationships could she have discovered? We'll never know, because she chose stasis over growth, chose mourning over living, chose devotion to the past over engagement with the present, and yet, and this is what makes Victoria's story so complex. In some ways, her excessive mourning served a purpose. It kept Albert's legacy alive. It ensured that his contributions weren't forgotten. It motivated her to build lasting institutions in his name. Her grief was productive, even as it was excessive. It accomplished things, even as it limited her. So was Victoria's 40 years of mourning a testament to eternal love or a sign of psychological dysfunction? Was it beautiful or tragic? Was it something to admire or something to pity? Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe grief that profound doesn't fit into simple categories. Maybe when you love someone as deeply as Victoria loved Albert, losing them breaks something in you that can never be fully repaired. And maybe the best you can do is find ways to live with the brokenness, to build a life around the hole where that person used to be, to honor their memory even as you acknowledge that nothing will ever be the same again. Victoria did that, not well, not healthily, but she did it. She survived 40 years without the person who'd been her entire world. She continued being queen, even though being queen without Albert felt meaningless. She raised her children and watched them marry and have children of their own. She witnessed Britain continue to grow and change and evolve. She was there for all of it, even though part of her had died on December 14th, 1861, and never came back. And through all those years, through all that grief, and all those mourning rituals, and all that devotion to a man who was gone, Victoria was building something else too. Something bigger than her personal loss. She was creating a legacy that would stretch far beyond her own life, far beyond Albert's life, far beyond anything either of them could have imagined when they first met at that birthday party in 1836, a legacy written in the lives of their descendants, in the institutions they had built, in the very concept of what monarchy could mean in the modern world. But to understand that legacy, to see how two people's love story rippled. out to touch millions of lives across continents and generations. We need to look beyond Victoria's grief to what she and Albert created together. We need to see their 9 children and 42 grandchildren and 87 great-grandchildren scattering across Europe, carrying Victoria and Albert's genes and values and complications into throne rooms from Britain to Russia to Germany to Spain. We need to see how a love that burned so bright and ended so tragically became the foundation for dynasties, for alliances, for conflicts that would reshape the world. Because the story of Victoria and Albert doesn't end with Albert's death. It just transforms into something larger and stranger and ultimately more consequential than either of them could have possibly foreseen. 9 children. When Victoria and Albert started their family, they'd probably imagined normal things. Maybe their children would be happy, healthy, successful. Maybe some would go into military service, or marry well, or make the family proud. Normal parental hopes, just on a royal scale. What they couldn't have imagined, what nobody could have imagined, was that their family tree would become a map of European power, that their descendants would sit on thrones from Britain to Russia, to Germany, to Spain, to Norway, to Romania, to Greece, that within 2 generations, Victoria and Albert's genes would be woven through virtually every major royal house in Europe, creating connections so dense that by 1914, most of Europe's monarchs were either related by blood or marriage. Victoria would become known as the grandmother of Europe. And that wasn't just a cute nickname. It was a literal description of how European politics worked in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Family reunions weren't just awkward dinners with relatives you barely knew. They were diplomatic summits where the future of nations was quietly negotiated. Artie, let me show you how this happened. How 2 people's 9 children became the foundation for a dynasty that would touch millions of lives and ultimately help trigger one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. We've already talked about Vicky, the eldest, brilliant, strong-willed, married to Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia, who would briefly become German Emperor Frederick III. Vicky and Frederick only got 99 days on the throne before Frederick died of throat cancer. But their son, Victoria and Albert's grandson, became Kaiser Wilhelm II, who would rule Germany from 1888 to 1918. Remember that name. We'll come back to Wilhelm. Then there was Alice, who married Ludwig the Grand Duke of Hesse. Alice was remarkable. She became a pioneering advocate for nursing and healthcare directly inspired by Florence Nightingale. She established nursing schools and hospitals, pushed for better public health standards. She died young at 35 from the diphtheria that she likely caught while nursing her own children through the illness. But her legacy lived on through her children, including one daughter named Alex, who became Alexandra Fedona, Empress of Russia, wife of Tsar Nicholas II. That's Victoria's granddaughter, married to the last Tsar of Russia. Again, remember that Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein and became known for her charitable work, serving as president of multiple nursing organizations. Louise, artistic independent Louise, shocked everyone by marrying John Campbell, 9th Duke of Argyll. He wasn't royalty, just British nobility. This was the first time a British monarch's child had married a subject rather than foreign royalty since 1515. It caused a scandal, but Louise didn't care. She was a talented sculptor and painter who wanted to choose her own path. Arthur had a distinguished military career and married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia, bore more German connections, strengthening ties between Britain and Prussia. Leopold tragically inherited hemophilia from Victoria and died at 30 after a fall. We'll come back to hemophilia. It's a crucial and tragic part of this story. And finally, Beatrice, the baby, who became Victoria's constant companion after Albert died. Beatrice married Prince Henry of Battenberg, and their descendants would eventually include Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, husband to Queen Elizabeth II. So that connection between Victoria and modern British royalty, direct line through Beatrice, But here's where it gets really interesting. It wasn't just Victoria's children who made strategic marriages. It was her 42 grandchildren, and eventually her 87 great-grandchildren. Victoria and Albert essentially seeded European royalty with their descendants, creating a web of family connection so complex that by the early 20th century you couldn't have a major European conflict without it being on some level of family dispute. Let me give you some examples. Victoria's grandchildren included King George V of Britain, father of both Edward VIII and George XV, grandfather of Queen Elizabeth II, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, son of Vicky, Serena Alexandra of Russia, daughter of Alice, Crown Princess Margaret of Sweden, whose descendants still reign in Sweden today, Queen Maud of Norway, Queen Marie of Romania, King Alonso I 13th of Spain, married Victoria's granddaughter, Victoria Eugenie, kings, queens, crown princes, and princesses scattered across the continent like seeds from a single tree. By Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, 50 years on the throne, she could look around at the celebrations and see her descendants occupying or about to occupy thrones throughout Europe. She was quite literally the matriarch of European royalty. When she died in 1901, her funeral was attended by monarch and crown princes from across the continent, most of them her children or grandchildren. It must have been an extraordinary moment. All these kings and queens and princes, rulers of vast empires and nations, gathering to mourn their grandmother. The woman who'd changed their diapers, who'd sent them birthday cards, who'd written them letters full of family gossip and advice. She was also the thread connecting all of them, the origin point of their power and position. Victoria and Albert had envisioned these marriages as ways to create peace through family connection. If European monarchs were all related, the thinking went they'd be less likely to go to war with each other. Blood ties would prevent bloodshed. Family loyalty would trump national ambition. It was a beautiful idea, and it was completely, tragically wrong. Because in 1914, when tensions that had been building for years finally exploded into World War I, Victoria's grandchildren found themselves on opposite sides. King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, all first cousins, all grandchildren of Victoria, leading their nations into a war that would kill millions. Wilhelm and George looked so similar they could have been brothers. There are photographs of them together in their youth, wearing matching naval uniforms, laughing. Nicholas and George looked so alike that people sometimes mistook them for each other. These weren't distant relatives who'd never met. These were cousins who'd grown up attending the same family gatherings, who'd played together as children, who'd corresponded regularly, and now they were enemies. German armies were fighting British armies. Russian armies were fighting German armies. Victoria's family tree had become a map of the conflict, with her descendants literally killing each other's subjects on battlefields across Europe. The iron, by the horrible tragic irony, is that the very family connections Victoria and Albert had created to ensure peace ended up making the war even more complicated and painful. These weren't just nations in conflict. These were relatives in conflict. The war had a personal dimension that made it even more bitter, even harder to end. There's a famous telegram exchange between Wilhelm and Nicholas in the days before war was officially declared, where they were addressing each other as Willie and Nicky, using their childhood nicknames, begging each other to step back from the brink. But they couldn't. The machinery of war was already in motion, driven by alliances and imperatives that went beyond personal relationships. Family love couldn't stop political momentum. And then there's the hemophilia, Victoria's other legacy to Europe, though this one was and devastating. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder where blood doesn't clot properly. Even minor injuries can cause dangerous bleeding. Before modern treatment, severe hemophilia was often fatal. The disease is carried on the X chromosome, which means women can be carriers without having symptoms themselves, but they can pass it to their sons, who will have the disease. Victoria was a carrier. We don't know where the mutation came from. It might have been spontaneous, a random genetic change that occurred in Victoria or in one of her parents. But once Victoria had it, she passed it to several of her children. Leopold had it and died young. Two of her daughters, Alice and Beatrice, were carriers who passed it to their children. This is where it gets historically significant. Remember Alexandra, Serena of Russia, Victoria's granddaughter. Through Alice, she was a hemophilia carrier, and she passed it to her son, Alexei Nikovich, heir to the Russian throne. Alexis's hemophilia was a closely guarded state secret. The Russian people, I didn't know their future Tsar, had a condition that could kill him from a simple bruise or fall. Alexandra, desperate to help her suffering son, turned to various healers and mystics, eventually falling under the influence of Gregory Rasputin, a controversial figure who seemed to be able to help Alexei when medical doctors couldn't. Whether through hypnosis, suggestion, or some other means, Rasputin could apparently ease Alexis's symptoms. This gave Rasputin enormous influence over Alexandra and through her over Tsar Nicholas. Rasputin used that influence to meddle in Russian politics, to get his allies appointed to government positions, to undermine people he didn't like. His presence at court became a massive scandal that severely damaged the royal family's reputation. Russian society was already unstable, already moving toward revolution. Rasputin's influence made things worse, made the monarchy seem corrupt and superstitious and unfit to rule. When the Russian Revolution came in 1917, when the Romanov dynasty fell, and Nicholas Alexandra and their children were eventually executed by the Bolsheviks, Victoria's hemophilia gene was part of that tragedy. Not the cause, obviously. The causes of the Russian Revolution were complex and deep-rooted, but Alexis's hemophilia led to Rasputin's influence, which contributed to the royal family's unpopularity, which was one factor among many that led to revolution and execution. Victoria's genetic legacy literally helped bring down the Russian Empire. A random mutation in her DNA rippled forward through generations to contribute to one of the 20th century's defining events. How many other people in history can you say that about? Other Victoria descendants also had hemophilia. Prince Alonso of Spain, son of King Alonso I, 13th, and Victoria's great-granddaughter Victoria Eugenie, died at 31 in a car accident where hemophilia complicated. Ons contributed to his death. Prince Gonzalo, his brother, died at 19 after a car crash, again with hemophilia as a contributing factor. Several other male descendants died young or suffered throughout their lives because of a gene they inherited from a great-great-grandmother they'd never met. By the modern century, through a combination of early deaths among hemophiliac males and the choice of some carrier females not to have children, the hemophilia largely bred out of European royal lines, but the damage had been done. Victoria's genetic legacy had touched lives across generations, causing suffering she never intended and could never have predicted. So what do we make of all this? Victoria and Albert created a dynasty that shaped Europe for generations. Their descendants ruled major powers, influenced politics, made decisions that affected millions of lives. That's an extraordinary legacy. That's the kind of impact most people can only dream of having. But it was also a legacy they couldn't control. They couldn't control how their grandchildren would use power. They couldn't control whether family bonds would prevent war or just make war more tragic. They couldn't control the genetic disease that would pass silently through generations, causing suffering and death and political upheaval. That's the thing about legacy. It's never just what you intend to pass down. It's all the consequences, intended, and that ripple forward from your existence. Victoria and Albert passed down their values, their love of education and progress, their commitment to public service. But they also passed down political complications, genetic diseases, family dynamics that would play out on a world stage with life and death consequences. Today, Victoria's descendants are still around. Current monarchs descended from Victoria include King Charles III of Britain, King Felipe V, 6th of Spa, In King Carl V. 16th, Gustav of Sweden, King Harald V. of Norway, Queen Margrethe II. Of Denmark, though she abdicated in 2024, and many others who hold or held positions of influence, if not actual thrones. If you drew Victoria's family tree today, it would look less like a tree and more like a web. Connections crisscrossing through multiple royal houses, connecting Britain to Spain, to Sweden, to Norway, to Denmark, to Germany. Though there's obviously no German monarchy anymore, Victoria's genes are everywhere in European royalty. She really did become the grandmother of Europe, and that legacy persists even now, more than a century after her death. So here's the question: was this a good thing? Did Victoria and Albert's dynasty make Europe better, more stable, more peaceful, or did it make conflicts more personal, more bitter, more complicated? Did it concentrate too much power in too few bloodlines? Did it create a system where who you were related to mattered more than what you could actually do? There's no simple answer. Like everything else about Victoria and Albert's story, their dynasty legacy is complicated, filled with both extraordinary achievement and terrible tragedy, with good intentions that sometimes produced bad outcomes, with love that couldn't prevent violence, with family bonds that couldn't overcome political realities. But this much is clear: when Victoria and Albert fell in love in 1839, when they married in 1840, when they had their 9 children and raised them with such care and high expectations, they weren't just building a family, they were building the framework for how Europe would work for the next century. They were creating connections that would shape wars and revolutions and the rise and fall of empires. They were leaving a mark on history that would be visible long after both of them were gone. And that brings us to the final question, the one that's been hanging over this entire story from the beginning. What does it all mean? What's the real lesson of Victoria and Albert's love story? Is it a romance to be celebrated? A cautionary tale about the costs of power? A testament to partnership? A warning about obsessive grief? An example of how personal relationships shape history, or something else entirely? Something more complex than any single interpretation can capture? To answer that, we need to step back and look at the whole arc of their story. One more time, not as separate episodes, but as a complete narrative, a love story that never died, but instead transformed into something bigger and stranger and more enduring than either of them could have imagined when they first met at that birthday party all those years ago. January 22nd, 1901, Osborne House, Isleworth, White. Victoria was 81 years old. She'd been queen for 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days, the longest reign in British history up to that point. She'd outlived all but 3 of her 9 children. She'd seen the world transform from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, from candlelight to electric lighting, from letters taking weeks to telegrams arriving in minutes. She'd witnessed empires rise and fall, technologies that would have seemed like magic in her youth become commonplace. She'd become a legend, an institution, almost more symbol than person. But in those final days of January, in her bedroom at Osborne House, the private retreat she and Albert had built together 60 years earlier, Victoria was just a dying woman, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Kaiser Wilhelm II was there, Victoria's eldest grandson, who'd rushed from Germany when he heard his grandmother was failing. King Edward III, Critty, Bertie the son Victoria had blamed for so long, held his mother's hand. Other children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren crowded into the room or waited anxiously outside, the whole family gathering to witness the end of an era. Victoria had prepared for this moment meticulously. Years earlier, she'd written detailed instructions about her funeral, about what should happen after her death, and some of those instructions were very specific about what should be buried with her. She wanted to wear her wedding veil, the veil she'd worn on February 10th, 1840, when she'd married Albert, She wanted Albert's dressing gown placed beside her in the coffin, the same dressing gown she'd slept with every night for 40 years. She wanted a plaster cast of Albert's hand included, so she could hold his hand one final time. But there were other items, too. Items she'd kept secret, even from most of her family, hidden beneath the flowers that would be arranged on top of her body, visible only to her personal physician, and dresses who prepared her for burial. Victoria wanted two things: a photograph of John Brown, the Scottish servant, who'd become her closest companion in the years after Albert's death, and a lock of Brown's hair. This caused some controversy even then, and historians still debate what Victoria's relationship with John Brown really was. Was it romantic? Was it just deep friendship? Whatever it was, Victoria clearly treasured Brown's memory alongside Albert's. She'd lost both men, and she wanted both of them with her in death. Think about what this tells us. Victoria's great love story, the one we've been following this whole time, was more complicated than simple devotion to one man. Yes, she loved Albert. Yes, she mourned him for 40 years. But she also found connection and comfort with John Brown. Afterward, her heart was big enough to hold multiple relationships, multiple kinds of love. She wasn't just Albert's widow. She was a full human being who kept living, kept feeling, kept needing companionship. Then, after the great love of her life was gone. But for this story, for this moment, what mattered was that Victoria was finally going to be reunited with Albert. She'd waited 40 years for this. 40 years of wearing black, of keeping his rooms unchanged, of sleeping with his dressing gown, of building monuments to his memory. 40 years of feeling incomplete, of going through the motions of life while the most essential part of herself remained frozen on December 14th, 1861. Now it was ending. Now she could rest. Now, according to her beliefs, the beliefs that sustained her through 4 decades of grief, she would see Albert again. Victoria died at 6:30 in the evening on January 22nd, surrounded by 3 generations of her descendants. Her last word, barely audible, was Bertie, the son she'd blamed, the son she'd pushed away, the son who was now king and who'd been holding her hand as she died. Her funeral was held on February 2nd, 1901 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. After 2 days of lying in state, Victoria was taken to Frogmore Royal Mausoleum, the elaborate memorial she'd built for Albert 40 years earlier, where Albert's body had been waiting for her all this time. And now they were together again. Victoria and Albert reunited at last, lying side by side for eternity, exactly as Victoria had planned and dreamed about for 4 decades. So here we are at the end of this story. Or maybe not the end. Maybe just another transformation, another chapter in a love story that keeps rippling forward through time. What do we take away from all this? What does Victoria and Albert's story teach us? I think it teaches us that love is never simple, never just one thing. Victoria and Albert's relationship was genuine love and political partnership. It was passion and power struggle. It was romance and compromise. It was fairy tale and daily grind. It was all of those things at once, messy and complicated and real. It teaches us that great partnerships require both people to give up something. Victoria gave up some of her independence. Albert gave up any hope of equal recognition. They both sacrificed parts of themselves to make their marriage work, and maybe that's what partnership always requires. Not losing yourself completely, but being willing to reshape yourself to accommodate another person's needs alongside your own. It teaches us about grief, how it can be both beautiful and destructive. Victoria's devotion to Albert's memory preserved his legacy, built lasting institutions, kept their love story alive for generations. But it also trapped her, limited her, kept her from fully living the 40 years she had after he died. Grief is love with nowhere to go, and Victoria never found a healthy place to put all that love after Albert was gone. It teaches us about legacy, how it's never entirely under our control. Victoria and Albert tried to create peace through family connections. They created complications instead. They tried to build a better world through education and progress. They succeeded in some ways and failed in others. They tried to raise 9 perfect children. They got 9 real human beings with their own strengths and weaknesses. You can shape your legacy, but you can't control it. But most of all, I think Victoria and Albert's story teaches us that love, real, deep, transformative love, changes everything it touches. It changed 2 people who met as awkward teenagers at a birthday party. It changed the British monarchy from a scandal-ridden institution into a model of family values. It changed fashion, changed Christmas traditions, changed how people thought about marriage and partnership. It created a dynasty that shaped Europe for generations. It built museums and monuments that still stand today. It left a mark on history that's still visible almost 200 years later. That's what love can do when it's allowed to flourish. When 2 people genuinely commit to each other, support each other, build something together, the impact extends far beyond just their own lives. It ripples outward, touching people and places and times they'll never see. Was Victoria and Albert's love perfect? No. They fought. They struggled. They made mistakes with their children and with each other. Albert worked himself to death. Victoria's grief became pathological. Their descendants ended up at war with each other. There's tragedy woven throughout this story, but it was real. It mattered. It changed the world. And isn't that what we're all hoping for, really? Not perfection, but meaning. Not a flawless fairy tale, but a real connection that makes our time on this earth matter. That leaves something behind. That proves we were here, and we loved, and that love meant something. Victoria and Albert had that. Despite all the complications, despite the grief and the loss and the tragedy, they had a love that literally never died. Because look, we're still talking about it. We're still moved by it. We're still trying to understand what they meant to each other and what their story means for us. When you walk past the Albert Memorial in London, when you visit the Victoria and Albert Museum, when you wear a white wedding dress or decorate a Christmas tree, or look at old photographs of your grandparents, you're experiencing echoes of Victoria and Albert's love story. It's still here, still shaping our world in small and large ways, still reminding us that love, real love, endures beyond death and time and all the things that try to diminish it. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Love doesn't end when a person dies. It transforms. It continues in memories, in legacies, in the lives touched by that love. Victoria spent 40 years proving that. 40 years insisting that Albert wasn't really gone as long as she remembered him, honored him, kept his memory alive. Was she right? Well, here we are, 120 plus years after Victoria died. And we're still talking about Albert, still acknowledging his contributions, his innovations, his partnership with Victoria, still seeing his influence in the world around us. Victoria succeeded in making sure Albert's legacy endured, and in doing so she created a love story that would endure right alongside it. So yes, Victoria and Albert's love never died. It just changed forms, from a marriage to a memory, from a memory to a legend, from a legend to a lesson about what's possible when 2 people choose each other and build something together that's bigger than both of them. Wherever you are right now, lying in bed, driving through the night, doing dishes or folding laundry, or just trying to relax before sleep, I hope their story touched something in you. I hope it reminded you that love is worth fighting for, that partnership requires work, but can be beautiful, that grief is the price we pay for love, but it's a price worth paying. I hope it made you think about your own relationships, your own legacy, your own impact on the world around you. Because you don't have to be Queen of Britain to matter. You don't have to marry a prince to build something lasting. You just have to love deeply. Choose wisely, commit fully, and let that love ripple outward into the world. That's what Victoria and Albert did. That's what their story teaches us. That's the legacy that never dies. Thank you for spending these hours with me, traveling back through time to meet two people who changed the world by loving each other. Thank you for listening to their story, the romance and the reality, the triumphs and the tragedies, the fairy tale and the truth. I hope you sleep well tonight. I hope your dreams are peaceful. And I hope that somewhere in those dreams, you remember that love, real, complicated, imperfect, beautiful love, is the most powerful force in the world. It was true for Victoria and Albert, and it's true for you too. Until next time, when we'll explore another story from history that shaped our world and continues to echo through time. Good night, sleep tight, and remember, the greatest love stories are the ones that change not just two lives, but countless lives across generations. May you find that kind of love. May you be that kind of love, and may you rest well knowing that your story, like Victoria and Albert's, matters more than you know. Sweet dreams.